The ivory dice tumble across green felt, their path determined by forces beyond human control. The roulette wheel spins, a blur of red and black, while somewhere a slot machine chimes its digital song. The shuffle of cards, the clink of chips, the collective intake of breath as fate reveals itself. These sounds echo across millennia, connecting us to ancestors who threw knucklebones in ancient Mesopotamia, who bet on chariot races in Rome, who gathered around gaming tables in gaslit Victorian parlours. Tonight, we trace the longest game in human history. Before we begin, we do not condone gambling, but tell us, when's the last time you have gambled? Not a single hand of cards or roll of dice, but the entire story of gambling itself. From the first moments when our ancestors looked at random chance and saw opportunity, through empires and revolutions, across continents and cultures, into the digital future that transforms everything, even as it changes nothing. This is a journey through human nature itself, through our relationship with risk, with luck, with the thrilling possibility that fortune might smile upon us if we dare to play. The story of gambling is inseparable from the story of civilization. Before there were written laws, there were games of chance. Before there were banks, there were betting pools. Before mathematics became a formal discipline, gamblers were calculating odds. In temples and taverns, palaces and prisons, battlefields and boardrooms, humans have always found ways to wager, to test fate, to transform uncertainty into entertainment or desperation or profit. What makes gambling so universal? Perhaps it is the fundamental randomness of existence itself. We are born into circumstances we do not choose. Events beyond our control shape our lives. Death comes to all, though we know not when. In the face of this cosmic uncertainty, gambling offers a peculiar comfort. It gives us a space where chance becomes explicit rather than hidden, where we can engage with randomness on our own terms, where the unknowable becomes merely unknown until the dice stop rolling or the card turns over. Or perhaps gambling speaks to something deeper still, to the human need for transcendence. In the moment between bet and outcome, anything is possible. The poor man might become rich. The losing streak might break. Fortune, that fickle goddess, might finally turn her face toward us. For those seconds or minutes while fate hangs in balance, we escape the mundane certainty of our circumstances and enter a realm of pure possibility. The moralists have always condemned gambling, of course. They see addiction, poverty, broken families, crime. They are not wrong. The history of gambling is stained with tragedy, with fortunes lost and lives destroyed, with the exploitation of human weakness for profit. But the moralists miss something essential. They miss the joy of the game, the thrill of risk, the social bonding around the table, the intellectual challenge of calculating odds and reading opponents. They miss the fact that gambling, like alcohol or sex or any other pleasure, can be enjoyed responsibly by most people most of the time, even as it ruins those who cannot control it. Throughout this long night, we will watch gambling evolve from simple ancient games to sophisticated global industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars. We will see how different cultures approached games of chance, how religions tried to suppress or regulate them, how mathematics emerged from gamblers' questions about probability. We will explore the psychology that makes gambling so compelling, the technology that transforms how we play, the eternal tension between those who would prohibit gambling and those who insist on their right to risk their money however they choose. We will meet the innovators who created the games we still play, the mathematicians who decoded the laws of chance, the entrepreneurs who built casinos in deserts and online, the card counters and handicappers who proved that skill could tilt the odds. We will visit the great gambling centers of history, from ancient Rome to medieval Venice, from frontier America to modern Macau. And we will consider where gambling is headed into virtual realities and blockchain technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors, even as they merely provide new venues for the same old human impulses. But we begin where all things begin, In the ancient world, where the first dice were cast and the first wagers made, where gambling was not yet an industry, but simply a part of life, as natural as eating or sleeping or making love, the desert sand holds secrets thousands of years old, and if we brush it away carefully, we find the bones of the game, waiting to tell their story, ancient origins, dice in the desert. The history of gambling begins before history itself. Long before humans invented writing to record their stories, they were playing games of chance. We know this because archaeologists have found the evidence, buried in tombs and ruins, preserved in the dry sand of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, scattered across sites where civilizations rose and fell thousands of years ago. The oldest gambling implements discovered are astragali, the knuckle bones of sheep and other animals. These bones are roughly cube-shaped with 6 sides, though not perfectly symmetrical like modern dice. Ancient peoples across the Middle East, Mediterranean, and Asia used them for games of chance at least 5,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. The bones were small enough to hold, distinct enough on each side to be identified when thrown, random enough in their landing to make the outcome unpredictable. Astragali have been found in archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia, that fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where civilization first emerged. The Sumerians, who developed one of the world's first writing systems around 3200 BCE, almost certainly gambled with these bones. Though we have no explicit written records of their gambling from the earliest periods, the ubiquity of astragali in their settlements suggests games of chance were common. By 3000 BCE, the Mesopotamians had developed more sophisticated gambling implements. Archaeologists have discovered dice made from various materials, including bone, wood, and stone. Some were marked on only 4 sides, creating a simpler game of chance. Others bore markings on all 6 sides, more like modern dice. These dice were not perfectly regular in shape or weight, meaning they would not fall with equal probability on each side. Whether this was intentional to allow cheating or simply a limitation of ancient manufacturing, we cannot know for certain. The royal game of discovered in tombs dating to around 2600 BCE, provides our clearest window into ancient Mesopotamian gambling. This board game, whose rules have been partially reconstructed from ancient cuneiform tablets, involved moving pieces across a board based on the throw of tetrahedral dice. The game combined chance and strategy, and evidence suggests it was played for stakes. Gambling on the outcome, or playing for valuable game pieces, would have been natural. The game was so popular it remained in use for over 3,000 years, spreading throughout the ancient Near East. Egypt, that other great cradle of civilization, had its own rich gambling tradition. The ancient Egyptians loved games, and where there are games, there is usually gambling. Paintings in tombs show people playing various games, and grave goods often included game boards and dice, suggesting these objects held enough value to accompany the dead into the afterlife. The Egyptian game of senet, which dates back at least to 3100 BCE, was phenomenally popular across all social classes. Senet boards have been found in the tombs of pharaohs and in the humble graves of common people. The game involved moving pieces across a board of 30 squares based on the throw of casting sticks or knuckle bones. Like many ancient games, senet had religious significance, being associated with the journey of the soul through the afterlife. But it was also played for entertainment and, we can assume, for wagers. Paintings from the New Kingdom period show scenes of everyday life that include gambling. Workmen building the pyramids and temples apparently enjoyed games of chance during their leisure time. The ancient Egyptians even had a hieroglyph that represented gambling, suggesting it was common enough to require its own written symbol. Records indicate that some people gambled away significant property, implying that betting was not limited to small stakes among the poor, but could involve substantial wealth. The ancient Egyptians' attitude toward gambling appears to have been relatively tolerant, at least compared to later civilizations. There are no known Egyptian laws prohibiting gambling, though there may have been social disapproval of excessive gambling that led to financial ruin. The Egyptians were fundamentally pragmatic people, and if gambling provided entertainment without causing social disruption, they seem to have been content to let it continue. As we move east into ancient India, we find some of the earliest written references to gambling in human literature. The Rig Veda, a collection of Sanskrit hymns composed between 1500 and 1200 BCE, contains a remarkable poem called The Gambler's Lament. This haunting text speaks in the voice of a compulsive gambler who has lost everything to dice, yet cannot stop playing. He describes the dice as hooks that torment him, speaks of his wife's suffering and his own shame, yet returns again and again to the game. This ancient poem reveals several important facts. First, that gambling was common enough in Vedic India to be a subject of literature. Second, that the problems of compulsive gambling were recognized even in this distant past. Third, that dice games could involve substantial stakes, enough to ruin families. The poem refers to dice made from the Vibhidaka nut, and archaeological evidence confirms that ancient Indians used these nuts, which when dried produce a roughly cubical shape suitable for use as dice. Later Indian literature, particularly the great epic Mahabharata, composed between 400 BCE and 400 CE, features gambling as a central plot element. The epic's protagonist, Yudhishthira, loses his kingdom, his brothers, and even his wife in a rigged dice game. The game of dice in the Mahabharata is not mere entertainment, but a dramatic device that sets in motion the epic's central conflicts. The story suggests that gambling was not only common, but could be a matter of the highest stakes, involving kingdoms and destinies. Ancient China developed its own distinctive gambling traditions. Chinese gambling history extends back at least to the Jia dynasty around 2000 BCE, though the evidence becomes clearer during the Shang dynasty from 1600 to 1046 BCE. The ancient Chinese used a form of die called tu-tu, and gambling on the outcome of dice throws was apparently common. But China's most significant contribution to gambling history came much later with the invention of playing cards and tile games. By the Tang dynasty, around 900 CE, the Chinese had developed playing cards, possibly evolving from earlier paper-based games. These were not quite like modern Western playing cards, but represented an important innovation that would eventually spread west and transform gambling worldwide. The Chinese also developed games using tiles, including early versions of mahjong and other games that combined chance and skill. Chinese gambling culture was distinct in its emphasis on games that involve both luck and strategy, rather than pure games of chance. This reflected broader Chinese philosophical attitudes about the balance between fate and human agency, between the random movements of the Tao and the ordered patterns that humans could discern and use. Throughout the ancient world, gambling served multiple functions. It was entertainment, a way to pass time in societies where most people had few leisure options. It was social bonding, a reason for people to gather, interact, and compete in structured ways. It was a test of fate, a way to divine the will of gods or the favor of fortune. In some cultures, gambling was used to settle disputes or make decisions, the random outcome being seen as expressing divine judgment. Gambling also played economic functions. In societies without sophisticated financial instruments, gambling provided a crude form of wealth redistribution. The lucky or skilled could improve their circumstances. The unlucky would lose, but the game would continue. This created a form of social mobility, however limited and random. It also provided a crude insurance mechanism, where the winner compensated for losses by taking from the unlucky, spreading risk across the gambling community. Religious attitudes toward gambling in the ancient world varied considerably. Some cultures saw gambling as a legitimate activity, possibly even sacred in certain contexts. Dice were sometimes used for divination, the random outcome being interpreted as the will of gods. Other cultures developed moral objections to gambling, seeing it as a vice that distracted from productive activity and led to poverty. The ancient Greeks provide an interesting case study in evolving attitudes toward gambling. Early Greek society apparently accepted gambling as a normal part of life. Homer's Iliad, composed around 800 BCE, mentions gambling, and ancient Greek pottery depicts dice games. The Greeks used astragali and also developed more regular dice, which they called kouboi. Gambling was common among all social classes, from slaves to aristocrats. But as Greek civilization matured, philosophical and moral objections to gambling emerged. Plato, in his Laws, expressed concern about gambling, seeing it as potentially corrupting to civic virtue. He did not advocate complete prohibition, but suggested gambling should be regulated and limited. Aristotle similarly viewed gambling with suspicion, though he acknowledged that games of chance had their place in leisure activities. Despite these philosophical reservations, gambling remained popular throughout the Greek world. Greeks bet on athletic competitions, dice games, cockfights, and various other contests of chance or skill. The Olympic Games and other pan-Hellenic festivals included not just athletic competition, but also associated gambling as spectators wagered on outcomes. This combination of spectacle and betting would become a recurring pattern throughout history, reaching its apotheosis in modern sports betting. The ancient world established patterns that would persist throughout gambling's history. Games of chance were created using whatever materials were available, from bones to nuts to carved stones. Gambling was both social entertainment and individual compulsion, both harmless fun and destructive vice. Societies struggled to define appropriate attitudes toward gambling, alternating between tolerance and prohibition. And always, regardless of laws or social attitudes, people found ways to play, to wager, to test their fate against chance. As civilizations grew more complex, so did gambling. The simple throw of knucklebones evolved into sophisticated games with elaborate rules. Stakes grew from small personal items to substantial wealth to kingdoms themselves, at least in legend. The social phenomenon of gambling attracted the attention of moralists, lawmakers, and philosophers, who debated its proper place in society. These debates would continue, largely unchanged in their essential arguments, for thousands of years. The ancient world gave us the fundamental tools and games of gambling. It established gambling as a universal human activity, present in every culture that left records. It demonstrated both the appeal of gambling and its dangers, and it raised questions about chance, fate, free will, and divine providence that gamblers and philosophers would continue to ponder throughout subsequent millennia. As the ancient world gave way to classical antiquity, gambling would reach new heights of popularity and social significance. Nowhere would this be more true than in Rome, where gambling became so pervasive that it defined an era and continues to influence how we think about games of chance today. Classical antiquity, Greece and Rome. If the ancient world planted the seeds of gambling, classical Greece and Rome brought them to full flower. In these civilizations, gambling evolved from scattered games played among common people to a cultural phenomenon that permeated society from the lowest slave to the emperor himself. The Greeks and Romans did not invent gambling, but they developed it into something approaching what we recognize today, with dedicated gambling establishments, professional gamblers, and the first serious legal attempts to control the activity. The Greeks, despite their philosophical reservations about gambling, were enthusiastic players. The Greek word for dice, kouboi, appears frequently in their literature, always with the understanding that dice games were common knowledge. Greeks gambled on dice, on knucklebones, on competitive events, on anything that could have an uncertain outcome. The random fall of dice was seen as an expression of chance, of Tyche, the goddess of fortune. To roll the dice was to consult fate itself. Greek mythology incorporated gambling in interesting ways. According to legend, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades rolled dice to divide the cosmos among themselves after defeating the Titans. Zeus won the heavens, Poseidon the seas, and Hades the underworld. Whether this myth predated Greek gambling or was created to reflect it, the story suggests how deeply gambling was embedded in Greek cultural consciousness. Even the gods were gamblers. Greek soldiers particularly embraced gambling. Archaeological evidence from military camps shows abundant dice and gaming pieces. Gambling provided entertainment during the long tedium of military campaigns, helped soldiers bond with their units, and offered the possibility of supplementing military pay. The Greek historian Herodotus mentions Lydian soldiers inventing games to distract themselves during a famine, suggesting gambling was seen as a way to cope with hardship. But it was in Rome that gambling reached unprecedented heights. The Romans were passionate gamblers, perhaps the most gambling-obsessed society in the ancient world. From the emperor in his palace to the beggar in the streets, Romans gambled. They bet on dice games, on chariot races, on gladiatorial combat, on animal fights, on board games, on virtually anything that involved competition or chance. Gambling permeated Roman life so thoroughly that it became a defining characteristic of Roman culture. The Romans played with dice they called tesserae, or tali, similar to Greek dice. Roman dice have been found throughout the empire, from Britain to Egypt, made from bone, ivory, bronze, amber, and precious stones. Wealthy Romans owned elaborate dice made from valuable materials and kept in ornate boxes. Common Romans made do with simple bone dice, but rich or poor, they all played. The most popular Roman dice game was uncertain in its exact rules, but we know it involved throwing multiple dice and achieving specific combinations. Various ancient sources mention people losing fortunes at dice, suggesting substantial stakes were common. Romans developed specialized gambling vocabulary, indicating how central gambling was to their culture. They had words for different types of bets, for gambling debts, for different kinds of gamblers. Roman law had a complicated relationship with gambling. Technically, gambling was illegal in Rome, except during the festival of Saturnalia, a week-long celebration in December when normal social rules were suspended. During Saturnalia, slaves could speak freely to masters, social hierarchies were temporarily inverted, and gambling was openly permitted. This annual permission probably reflected the reality that Romans gambled year-round, regardless of the law. Outside Saturnalia, gambling laws were honored mainly in the breach. Wealthy Romans gambled openly with little fear of prosecution. The Emperor Claudius was a notorious gambler who even wrote a book about gambling strategy. The Emperor Nero gambled for stakes of 400,000 sesterces per pip on the dice, an astronomical sum. If emperors flagrantly violated gambling laws, ordinary citizens felt little compulsion to obey them. The law did create one interesting workaround. Since gambling debts were not legally enforceable in Rome, clever gamblers could refuse to pay, claiming the debt was from illegal activity. This led to an honor system among gambling aristocrats, where refusing to pay gambling debts would destroy one's reputation, even though it was technically legal. The social pressure to pay debts of honor was apparently stronger than legal obligation. Roman literature is filled with references to gambling and gamblers. The poet Ovid mentioned dice games in his works. The satirist Juvenal complained about compulsive gamblers ruining themselves. The philosopher Seneca criticized gambling as a waste of time and money, though his criticism suggests gambling was so common that it needed philosophical refutation. The Romans also gambled on public spectacles, and here gambling reached its most spectacular expression. The chariot races held in the Circus Maximus were the most popular entertainment in Rome, drawing crowds of up to 250,000 spectators. These races were not merely sporting events but occasions for massive gambling. Romans bet on their favorite teams, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, with passionate loyalty that sometimes erupted into violence. Fortunes changed hands at the races. Entire estates were reportedly wagered on single races. Gladiatorial combat provided another venue for Roman gambling. These brutal contests, where trained fighters battled to the death for public entertainment, drew enormous crowds to amphitheaters throughout the empire. Spectators bet on individual gladiators, on the outcomes of specific fights, on how long combats would last. The gambling added excitement to spectacles that were already gripping and brutal. The combination of blood sport and betting created an intoxicating entertainment that Romans found irresistible. Animal hunts in the arena, where exotic beasts were slaughtered by the hundreds, also attracted betting. Romans wagered on how many animals would be killed, which animals would last longest, which hunters would be successful. The sheer scale of these spectacles and their associated gambling was unprecedented in human history, and would not be matched until modern times. The social attitudes toward gambling in Rome were complex and contradictory. On one hand, gambling was technically illegal and morally disapproved by the respectable classes. Excessive gambling was seen as a vice that indicated weak character. Compulsive gamblers were mocked in literature and looked down upon in society. On the other hand, casual gambling was nearly universal, and even excessive gambling was tolerated among the wealthy and powerful. This contradiction reflected a broader Roman attitude toward vice. Romans moralized about virtue and self-control, while simultaneously indulging in behaviors they claimed to condemn. Gambling, like prostitution, heavy drinking, and lavish spending, was simultaneously condemned and practiced. The gap between stated values and actual behavior was enormous, and apparently did not trouble most Romans. The economic impact of Roman gambling was significant. Money and goods flowed through gambling networks, redistributing wealth in ways that official economic structures did not. Professional gamblers emerged, people who made their living from games of chance and skill. Gambling dens operated throughout Roman cities, providing venues for those who wanted to play away from public scrutiny. These establishments were often associated with other vices like prostitution and excessive drinking, creating disreputable but thriving underground economies. Gambling also had political dimensions in Rome. Accusations of gambling debts were sometimes used to attack political opponents. Being in debt to gamblers could make a politician vulnerable to manipulation or blackmail. The Roman concept of dignitas, the dignified bearing expected of aristocrats, was supposedly incompatible with desperate gambling, yet many prominent Romans gambled heavily. The contradiction between ideal and reality created opportunities for political attack. As Rome declined and eventually fell, gambling remained a constant. The late empire saw no reduction in gambling, despite economic hardship and social instability. If anything, gambling may have increased as people sought distraction from an increasingly troubled world. The barbarian peoples who conquered Rome brought their own gambling traditions, which mixed with Roman practices to create new forms. The classical world established gambling as a permanent feature of Western civilization. The Greeks provided philosophical reflection on gambling's meaning and dangers. The Romans demonstrated gambling's potential to become a society-wide obsession, permeating all levels of social life. Both civilizations wrestled with the question of how to regulate gambling, trying various legal approaches without ever finding a satisfactory answer. When Rome fell and Europe entered the medieval period, gambling did not disappear. It adapted, survived, and eventually flourished again under new conditions. The Germanic tribes, the Byzantines, the Islamic caliphates, all had their own gambling traditions. But before we turn to medieval Europe, we must look eastward, to the great civilizations of Asia, where gambling developed along parallel but distinct paths. Eastern traditions, China, India, and beyond, while Greece and Rome were developing their gambling cultures in the West. The great civilizations of Asia were creating their own rich traditions of games and wagering. These Eastern traditions were in many ways more sophisticated than their Western counterparts, developing games of greater complexity that combined chance with skill in intricate ways. The East gave the world playing cards, complex tile games, and mathematical insights into probability. Eastern gambling culture would eventually influence the entire world, creating games and traditions that persist to this day. China's gambling history extends back into the prehistoric mists, but becomes clearer during the classical period. During the Han Dynasty, from 206 BCE to 220 CE, gambling was immensely popular throughout Chinese society. The Chinese played dice games, board games, and various contests that involved wagering. Government officials attempted to regulate gambling with limited success. The prohibitions themselves testify to gambling's prevalence. You do not ban activities that nobody practices. Chinese gambling differed from Western gambling in its emphasis on games that combined luck and skill. Pure games of chance existed, but Chinese culture generally preferred games where a clever player could gain advantage through strategic thinking. This reflected Chinese philosophical attitudes about the relationship between fate and human agency. Confucian thought emphasized human responsibility and the possibility of self-cultivation. Taoism taught about the flow of natural patterns that could be understood and harmonized with. Both philosophies suggested that outcomes were not merely random, but could be influenced by wisdom and virtue. The most significant Chinese contribution to gambling history was the invention of playing cards. The exact date and circumstances remain uncertain, but evidence suggests playing cards emerged in China during the Tang dynasty, around the 9th century CE. These early cards were not identical to modern Western playing cards, but represented a crucial innovation. Cards were portable, could represent many different values or symbols, and enabled games of great complexity. Chinese playing cards were typically narrow slips of paper or cardboard, often decorated with suit symbols derived from Chinese coins. The games played with these cards varied, but many involved comparing card values, making combinations, and wagering on outcomes. These games spread throughout East Asia, evolving into different forms in Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The cards themselves evolved, with different regions developing their own suit symbols and game rules. China also developed tile games, the most famous being mahjong. While mahjong in its modern form emerged relatively late during the Qing dynasty in the 19th century, it evolved from earlier tile games with ancient roots. Mahjong combines chance, skill, memory, and strategy in complex ways. The tiles are drawn randomly, but skilled players can significantly improve their odds through careful observation and strategic decisions. This combination made mahjong appealing to Chinese sensibilities and enabled it to spread worldwide in the 20th century. The Chinese also developed various forms of lottery. By the Han Dynasty, lotteries were being used by the government to raise funds for public projects. The Great Wall of China was allegedly funded partly through lottery revenues. These early lotteries involved selecting characters from Chinese texts, creating a random selection process. The concept of the lottery, using randomness to distribute prizes while raising revenue, would become crucial to global gambling history. Chinese attitudes toward gambling were ambivalent. On one hand, gambling was seen as a wasteful vice that could lead to poverty and family destruction. Confucian morality emphasized frugality, hard work, and family responsibility, all values that excessive gambling violated. Many Chinese dynasties enacted laws against gambling, sometimes with severe penalties, including flogging or exile. On the other hand, gambling remained popular throughout Chinese history, suggesting the prohibitions were not very effective. The Chinese recognized gambling's social functions. Moderate gambling was seen as acceptable entertainment, a way to bond with friends and family, particularly during festivals. The Chinese New Year was traditionally a time when gambling restrictions were relaxed, similar to the Roman Saturnalia. This cultural permission valve allowed gambling to occur in controlled contexts while maintaining the fiction of official disapproval. India's gambling tradition, as we noted earlier, extends back to the Vedic period and earlier. The sophistication of Indian gambling is evident in ancient Sanskrit literature, which describes various dice games with elaborate rules. The ancient Indian game of pachisi played on a cross-shaped board with cowrie shells used as dice, was popular among royalty and commoners alike. The Mughal Emperor Akbar supposedly played pachisi on a giant outdoor board, using slave girls dressed in colourful costumes as the playing pieces. Indian dice games typically used long rectangular dice, quite different from the cubic dice of the West. These dice were made from the vibhidaka nut or carved from wood or bone. The elongated shape created different probability distributions than cubic dice, adding complexity to the games. Indian mathematicians studied these probabilities, contributing to the development of mathematical thinking about chance. Buddhism, which emerged in India around the 5th century BCE, had complex attitudes toward gambling. Early Buddhist texts describe gambling as one of the 6 causes of ruin, warning that it leads to poverty and moral degradation. The Buddha supposedly taught that gambling should be avoided as part of right livelihood. However, some Buddhist traditions were more tolerant, seeing moderate gambling as acceptable recreation. The diversity of Buddhist attitudes reflected broader debates within Indian society about gambling's proper role. Hinduism similarly had ambivalent attitudes. On one hand, Dharma, the principle of righteous living, seemed incompatible with gambling. On the other hand, the great epics featured gambling prominently, and divine figures were sometimes associated with games of chance. The balance between condemning gambling as a vice and accepting it as part of human nature created a complex moral landscape that varied across time and regions. Indian playing cards, which may have developed independently or been influenced by Chinese cards, were circular rather than rectangular. These round cards, called ganjifa, were often beautifully painted with miniature artwork. They came in sets of 96 or more cards divided into 8 or more suits. The games played with these cards were complex, involving trick-taking, melding, and wagering. Ganjifa cards represented a distinctly Indian approach to card games, more elaborate and decorative than their Western counterparts. Japan developed its own gambling traditions, though often under Chinese influence. During the Heian period, from 794 to 1185 CE, gambling was popular among the aristocracy. Japanese nobles played various games involving dice, cards, and boards. As Japanese culture evolved, it developed distinctive games like hanafuda, flower cards used for various gambling games. Japan also developed a strong tradition of gambling on competitive events like sumo. Wrestling. Japanese attitudes toward gambling were shaped by both Buddhist influence and the practical concerns of the ruling classes. Many Japanese regimes attempted to prohibit or restrict gambling, viewing it as a drain on productivity and a cause of social problems. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan from 1603 to 1868, enacted strict gambling prohibitions. Yet gambling persisted, often in connection with festivals or religious celebrations where temporary permission was granted. Southeast Asian cultures developed their own gambling traditions, often blending indigenous practices with influences from China, India, and later from Arab and European traders. Thai, Vietnamese, Khmer, and other Southeast Asian peoples played dice games, card games, and bet on cockfights, animal contests, and human competitions. The blend of Buddhist religious influence and local cultural practices created attitudes toward gambling that varied across the region, but generally followed patterns of official prohibition and practical tolerance. The Islamic world, which by the medieval period stretched from Spain to Indonesia, had clear religious teachings against gambling. The Quran explicitly forbids gambling, calling it an abomination and a device of Satan. Islamic law, Sharia, prohibits maisir, games of chance, as well as gharar, contracts involving excessive uncertainty. This religious prohibition was taken seriously in many Islamic societies, with gambling being criminally punishable. However, even in Islamic societies, gambling persisted. The prohibition was strongest and most enforced in the Arabian heartland and during periods of religious intensity. In other times and places, Gambling occurred despite the prohibition, often in forms that were argued to be skill-based rather than pure chance, or in private settings where authorities were unlikely to intervene. The Islamic prohibition on gambling remains influential today, shaping gambling laws in Muslim-majority countries. The Eastern traditions gave the world some of its most enduring gambling innovations. Playing cards, which emerged in China and India, would be transformed in Europe into the familiar suits we know today. The concept of combining chance and skill in complex games influenced Western game design. The mathematical study of probability, which eventually developed in Europe, was preceded by practical observation of odds in Chinese and Indian gambling. The lottery concept, developed in China, would become a crucial government revenue tool worldwide. Eastern gambling culture also demonstrated alternative ways of thinking about chance and fate, where Western thought often posed a sharp dichotomy between random chance and divine providence, or between luck and skill. Eastern philosophies were more comfortable with ambiguity. The Taoist concept of following natural patterns, the Buddhist teaching about karma and causation, the Hindu ideas about dharma and cosmic order, all provided frameworks for understanding gambling that were neither purely deterministic nor purely random. As we turn now to medieval Europe, we will see how Eastern innovations, particularly playing cards, arrived in the West and were transformed. We will see how Christian attitudes toward gambling, shaped by ancient Hebrew prohibitions and early Christian asceticism, created a moral climate very different from the tolerant confusion of classical Rome. And we will see how gambling, despite official condemnation and legal prohibition, flourished in medieval society from castle to cottage, becoming embedded in European culture in ways that persist today. Medieval Europe. Cards, dice and the devil. The medieval period in Europe, roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was a time of profound religious faith, feudal social structures, and periodic violence. It was also, despite the moral strictures of the church, a time of enthusiastic gambling. Medieval Europeans gambled on dice, on cards after their introduction, on animal fights, on archery and other contests of skill, and on anything else that could have an uncertain outcome. Gambling was so pervasive that moralists and lawmakers railed against it constantly, a sure sign of its popularity. The early medieval period inherited Roman gambling traditions, but in a transformed social context. The Roman Empire had fallen in the West, replaced by Germanic kingdoms with their own cultural practices. The Christian Church, which had been a persecuted minority in early imperial Rome, was now the dominant religious and moral authority. The Church's attitude toward gambling would shape medieval European gambling culture profoundly. Christianity inherited a complex attitude toward gambling from its Jewish roots. The Hebrew Bible does not explicitly prohibit gambling, though some rabbinical interpretations of biblical passages suggested disapproval. Early Christians were more consistently hostile. Church fathers like St. Augustine condemned gambling as a vice, arguing it encouraged greed, laziness, and antisocial behavior. By the medieval period, official church teaching held that gambling was sinful, though not all gambling was equally condemned. The church distinguished between different forms of gambling. Games of pure chance, where no skill was involved, were seen as particularly problematic because they seemed to trivialize the providence of God. If God controlled all outcomes, then gambling on random events was attempting to manipulate divine will for personal gain. This was a form of impiety, attempting to use sacred power for profane purposes. Games that involved skill were less objectionable, since human ability could legitimately affect outcomes. Despite church condemnation, medieval Europeans gambled enthusiastically. Dice were particularly popular, being cheap to make and easy to play. Medieval dice were usually made from bone or wood, carved into cubes and marked with spots or numbers. They were not perfectly regular, and some dice were deliberately weighted or shaved to favor certain numbers, creating opportunities for cheating. Professional gamblers and confidence men made their living by introducing loaded dice into games. Medieval literature is filled with references to gambling and gamblers. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, mentions gambling several times. The Pardoner's Tale features 3 gamblers who come to a bad end, reflecting moral teaching about gambling's dangers. But the very frequency of gambling references in medieval literature indicates how common the activity was. Writers moralized against gambling because it was ubiquitous, not exotic. Knights and nobles gambled heavily despite their elevated social status. Medieval romances and chronicles record instances of nobles losing vast sums at dice or cards. King Richard the Lionheart of England, famous for his crusading zeal, was apparently also fond of gambling. During the Third Crusade, he and King Philip Augustus of France gambled together, perhaps to relieve the boredom of warfare. The combination of martial masculinity and gambling risk created an aristocratic culture where wagering was seen as part of noble comportment. Despite church disapproval, the common people also gambled, though their stakes were necessarily smaller. Medieval peasants bet on dice, on contests of strength or skill, on animal fights. Taverns were centers of working-class gambling, providing venues where men could drink, socialize, and wager. These gambling sessions were both recreation and social bonding, creating networks of obligation and friendship that structured village life. A man who refused to gamble might be seen as aloof or untrustworthy, while excessive gambling that led to poverty would bring social shame. The introduction of playing cards to Europe in the late 14th century transformed medieval gambling. Cards arrived from the Islamic world, possibly via Spain or Italy, around 1370. These early European cards were not identical to modern playing cards, but shared the basic concept of suits and ranks. The earliest European cards were luxury items, hand-painted by artists, affordable only to the wealthy. But the technology of card-making improved rapidly, and by the early 15th century, woodblock printing made cards affordable to broader populations. Playing cards enabled new forms of gambling that were more complex and varied than dice games. Card games could involve multiple players, complex betting rounds, bluffing, and psychological play. The combination of chance in the deal and skill in the play made card games intellectually engaging in ways that pure dice games were not. Card games quickly became immensely popular throughout Europe, spreading faster than nearly any other cultural innovation of the period. The church initially responded to playing cards with suspicion and hostility. Some clergymen denounced cards as the devil's picture book, claiming the face cards represented unholy figures. The randomness of card shuffling and dealing was seen as a form of sortilege, divination through random means, which church teaching condemned. Various local church authorities attempted to prohibit cards, with predictably limited success. But cards were too popular to be suppressed. By the mid-15th century, even some clergy were playing cards, though officially they were not supposed to. The church gradually adjusted its position, distinguishing between moderate card playing for entertainment and excessive gambling that led to sin. This compromise position, condemning excess while tolerating moderate use, would become the standard church attitude toward gambling. Medieval card games developed rapidly in sophistication. By 1500, most of the basic card game structures that still exist today had been invented. Trick-taking games where players try to win rounds by playing high cards emerged early. Banking games, where one player or the house takes bets from others, also appeared. The variety of possible games made cards endlessly fascinating, each game creating different strategic challenges and gambling opportunities. The suits and court cards of playing cards evolved during the medieval period. Different European regions developed their own suit systems. Italian cards used swords, batons, cups, and coins. German cards used acorns, leaves, hearts, and bells. Spanish cards were similar to Italian. The French suit system of spades, hearts, diamonds, and clubs, which emerged in the late 15th century, eventually became dominant, and is the system we use today. The court cards also evolved, with the king, queen, and jack representing different figures in different regional traditions. Medieval gambling was not limited to dice and cards. People bet on all sorts of competitions and uncertain events. Archery contests, wrestling matches, and other tests of skill drew wagers. Animal fights, particularly cockfighting and dogfighting, were popular gambling events. These blood sports, which seem cruel by modern standards, were common entertainment in medieval Europe, and gambling added to their appeal. The combination of spectacle and wagering created events that were both viscerally exciting and economically significant for participants. Horse racing also emerged as a gambling venue during the medieval period, though it would not reach its full development until later centuries. Medieval nobles bred horses for war, and naturally they wanted to test which horses were fastest and strongest. Racing these horses against each other, with spectators wagering on outcomes, was a natural development. These early races lacked the organization and formality of later horse racing, but they established the connection between equestrian sport and gambling that persists today. Medieval law attempted to regulate gambling with varying degrees of seriousness and success. Many jurisdictions prohibited certain forms of gambling, particularly dice games, or limited gambling to specific times and places. England's King Henry VII, who reigned from 1485 to 1509, prohibited dice playing for stakes among common people, though apparently nobles were exempt. The rationale was partly moral, but also practical. Gambling was seen as wasting time that should be spent on productive labor or military training. The enforcement of gambling laws was sporadic and often ineffective. Local authorities might crack down on gambling during periods of moral reform, or when gambling-related violence became too public. But for most of the time, gambling continued openly with little interference. The gap between law and practice was enormous, reflecting the fundamental tension between moral ideals and human behavior that characterized much of medieval life. Medieval gambling also had a dark side that moralists were right to fear. Gambling debts could lead to violence. Disputes over games could escalate into deadly fights, particularly when drink and weapons were involved. Loaded dice and marked cards were common forms of cheating, and accusations of cheating often led to brawls. Medieval taverns, the main venues for working-class gambling, were dangerous places where gambling, drinking, and fighting mixed in volatile combinations. The impoverishment caused by gambling was also real. The gambler's lament from ancient India had its medieval European equivalents. Moralists told stories of gamblers who lost everything, who abandoned their families, who turned to crime to support their habit. These stories were not mere propaganda. Compulsive gambling destroyed lives in medieval Europe just as it had in ancient Rome and would in modern times. The psychological mechanisms that make gambling addictive for some people operated in medieval brains just as they do in ours. Women's gambling in medieval Europe is less well documented than men's, partly because women had fewer opportunities and resources to gamble, and partly because male writers paid less attention to women's activities. But evidence suggests women did gamble, particularly among the upper classes, where women had access to money and leisure. Medieval moralists sometimes warned specifically against women gambling, suggesting it was common enough to be concerning. As with so many aspects of women's medieval lives, the historical record is frustratingly incomplete. The medieval period also saw the beginning of what would become modern lotteries. Various European cities and principalities used lottery-style drawings to raise funds for public projects or to distribute goods. These early lotteries were not quite like modern ones, but they established the basic principle of selling chances to win prizes, with the revenue supporting some public purpose. The lottery would become a crucial gambling form in later centuries, combining the appeal of gambling with the legitimacy of funding public goods. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, gambling remained deeply embedded in European culture. The moral condemnation had not eliminated it, The legal prohibitions had not stopped it. The practical problems had not discouraged it. Europeans loved gambling, and they would continue to gamble through wars, plagues, famines, and religious upheavals. The next few centuries would see gambling evolve from an informal activity to an organized industry, from random games in taverns to elegant casinos in palaces. The transformation would begin in Italy, spread to France, and eventually encompass the world. The birth of modern gambling, Renaissance to Enlightenment, the Renaissance, that flowering of European culture from the 14th to 17th centuries, brought profound changes to gambling. As Europe emerged from medieval patterns, as cities grew wealthy from trade, as new ideas about human potential and individual achievement spread, gambling evolved as well. This was the period when gambling began its transformation from informal games into organized entertainment, when the first casinos opened, when mathematics began to analyze chance systematically. The gambling we recognize today has its roots in Renaissance Italy and Enlightenment France. Venice, that jewel of the Adriatic, was at the forefront of gambling innovation. By the 15th century, Venice was one of Europe's wealthiest cities, grown rich from trade between Europe and Asia. Venetian merchants brought goods and ideas from around the world, including games and gambling practices. The city's culture emphasized pleasure, spectacle, and entertainment. Gambling fit naturally into this worldview. The Venetian government took a pragmatic approach to gambling. Rather than attempting to prohibit what could not be stopped, they chose to regulate and tax it. This created a legal framework for organized gambling that was unprecedented in Europe. In 1638, Venice opened the Ridotto, often considered the world's first legal public casino. The Ridotto was located in a palazzo during Venice's famous carnival season, providing a controlled environment for gambling. The Ridotto was not a casino in the modern sense. It operated only during Carnival, that period of license before Lent when Venice celebrated with masks, costumes, and revelry. The games offered were primarily Basetta, an early banking game, and Biribi, a lottery-style game. The atmosphere was elegant, the clientele wealthy. Players wore masks, as was customary during Carnival, creating an air of mystery and transgression even in this officially sanctioned venue. The Ridotto model spread to other Italian cities and eventually to other countries. The concept of a government-licensed gambling establishment, where games were offered in controlled conditions with house rules and oversight, represented a fundamental shift in how gambling was organized. Previous gambling had been informal, occurring in taverns, homes, or streets. The casino model centralized gambling, made it visible, and created opportunities for taxation and regulation that informal gambling could not provide. France embraced gambling with particular enthusiasm during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. The French court under Louis XIV, the Sun King who reigned from 1643 to 1715, was a center of gambling activity. The king himself was a dedicated gambler, and his courtiers followed his example. Card games like Basset and Faro were played for enormous stakes. Fortunes were won and lost nightly at the royal court. This aristocratic gambling set the tone for French society, where gambling was seen as sophisticated entertainment rather than low vice. The French developed many of the card games that would become classics. Piquet, a two-player trick-taking game, was popular among nobles. 21, literally 21, was an early version of blackjack. Poker, an early form of poker, emerged in France before being carried to America, where it would evolve into the game we know today. French card game innovation was remarkable, creating games of such elegance and complexity that many remain popular centuries later. But the French Renaissance contribution to gambling went beyond new games. It was during this period that mathematics began to seriously analyze gambling, transforming our understanding of chance and probability. This mathematical revolution would eventually change gambling from a purely recreational activity to something that could be systematically studied and understood. The story begins with a problem posed to the French mathematician Blaise Pascal in 1654. A French nobleman and amateur mathematician named Chevalier de Mireille had a gambling question. If a dice game is interrupted before completion, how should the stakes be divided fairly between the players? This problem of points, as it was called, required determining the probability of each player winning if the game continued, even though it had not actually finished. Pascal corresponded with another mathematician, Pierre de Fermat, to solve this problem. Their exchange of letters in 1654 is considered the birth of probability theory. Pascal and Fermat developed mathematical methods for calculating probabilities, for determining expected values, for analyzing games of chance in systematic ways. This was revolutionary. For thousands of years, gamblers had relied on intuition, experience, and superstition. Now mathematics offered a rigorous way to understand chance. The implications were profound and would take centuries to fully develop. If probability could be calculated mathematically, then optimal gambling strategies could be derived. Games could be analyzed to determine house edges. Risk could be quantified rather than merely felt. The randomness that had seemed mysterious could be tamed by reason. This Enlightenment faith in human reason extended even to the role of dice. Pascal's work on probability was motivated by gambling, but its applications extended far beyond. Probability theory would become fundamental to statistics, to science, to engineering, to finance, to any field dealing with uncertainty. The insurance industry, which prices risk, depends on probability theory. Modern science, which uses statistical methods to evaluate evidence, relies on concepts Pascal and Fermat pioneered. All of this emerged from trying to solve a gambler's question about dividing stakes fairly. Other mathematicians built on Pascal and Fermat's foundation. Christian Huygens published the first book on probability theory in 1657, systematizing the emerging field. Jacob Bernoulli's work on the law of large numbers, published posthumously in 1713, showed that with enough trials, empirical frequencies would converge on theoretical probabilities. This provided a bridge between mathematical theory and practical gambling experience. Abraham de Moivre, working in the early 18th century, wrote The Doctrine of Chances, a comprehensive treatment of probability applied to gambling. De Moivre calculated probabilities for dice games, card games, and lotteries. He developed techniques that remain fundamental to probability theory. His work was motivated by practical concerns about gambling, but produced mathematics of lasting theoretical importance. The development of probability theory did not immediately transform gambling practice. Most gamblers continue to rely on intuition and superstition rather than mathematics. But a few clever gamblers recognized the power of mathematical analysis. They understood that in games with calculable odds, systematic analysis could provide an edge. The advantage was often small, but over many games, small edges compounded into significant profits. The professional gambler, armed with mathematical knowledge, began to emerge as a distinct type. During this period, gambling spread beyond aristocratic courts and Italian casinos to broader populations. Coffeehouses in England became centers of gambling activity in the 17th and 18th centuries. These establishments, where men gathered to drink coffee, read newspapers, and discuss business, also offered opportunities to gamble. Some coffeehouses specialized in particular games or types of gambling. Lloyd's Coffee House, which would eventually become Lloyd's of London Insurance Market, began as a gathering place for merchants who bet on ships' safe arrivals. The proliferation of gambling venues created demand for professional gambling equipment. Playing card manufacturing became a significant industry. Workshops in France, England, and Germany produced cards in vast quantities, using printing techniques that lowered costs while maintaining quality. Dice makers similarly produced large numbers of dice, attempting to make them as regular and fair as possible, though perfect fairness remained elusive with hand manufacturing techniques. Gambling also became intertwined with other forms of entertainment and spectacle. The theatre in Restoration England was closely associated with gambling. Audiences bet on performances, actors maintained gambling connections, and the demi-monde of theatre and gambling overlapped. Horse racing, which would become one of the world's premier gambling sports, began to be organised systematically in England during this period. The first recorded horse race in England occurred in 1622, and by the late 17th century, regular race meetings were established. The moral debate about gambling continued throughout the Renaissance and Enlightenment, but the terms shifted somewhat. Medieval moral arguments had focused on gambling as sinful, as violating religious duties, as tempting divine punishment. Enlightenment critics were more likely to argue that gambling was irrational, wasteful, or socially destructive. The shift from religious to secular criticism reflected broader intellectual changes, though many critics continued to use both religious and secular arguments. Some Enlightenment thinkers defended gambling on libertarian grounds. If rational individuals chose to gamble with their own money, by what right did government or church interfere? This argument, which would become important in later debates about gambling prohibition, emerged during this period. The tension between paternalistic protection and individual liberty that characterizes modern gambling. Debates had its origins in Enlightenment political philosophy. As the 18th century progressed and gave way to the 19th, gambling was poised for another transformation. The Industrial Revolution would create new wealth and new populations in cities, both providing expanded markets for gambling. The movement of peoples across oceans would carry gambling traditions to new continents. And in the New World, particularly in America, gambling would find fertile ground and develop in ways that would eventually reshape global gambling culture. The story of gambling now crosses the Atlantic to the colonies and frontiers where European traditions would meet Native American practices and African influences, creating distinctive American gambling culture. The New World. Colonial America and the frontier gambling came to America with the first European settlers, carried in their cultural baggage alongside their languages, religions, and tools. The colonists who established Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620 brought gambling habits from England, and despite the Puritan settlers' religious scruples, gambling quickly established itself in the New World. The vast American continent, with its promise of new beginnings and its reality of harsh conditions, proved remarkably hospitable to gambling. From colonial dice games to frontier poker, from church raffles to state lotteries, gambling would become woven into the American experience in ways both celebrated and condemned. The earliest English colonies had varied attitudes toward gambling, reflecting the diversity of settler populations. The Virginia colony, established by profit-seeking adventurers and later plantation owners, was relatively tolerant of gambling. Card games, dice, horse racing, and various other forms of wagering were common among Virginia colonists. The wealthy planter class particularly embraced gambling as part of their aristocratic lifestyle, modelled on English gentry. They bet on horse races, cockfights, and card games, sometimes for substantial stakes. New England, settled largely by Puritans seeking religious freedom, took a much dimmer view of gambling. The Puritans saw gambling as sinful idleness, a waste of time that should be spent in productive labor or religious devotion. Massachusetts Bay Colony enacted laws against gambling as early as the 1630s, prohibiting cards, dice, and other games of chance. These laws reflected Puritan theological convictions about human depravity and the need for strict moral regulation. Yet even in Puritan New England, gambling persisted. Laws were broken, enforcement was imperfect, and human nature resisted moral strictures. Court records from colonial New England document prosecutions for illegal gambling, evidence that people continued to gamble despite legal and social disapproval. The gap between ideal and practice that characterized gambling throughout history was present in America from the beginning. The middle colonies, including New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, fell somewhere between Virginia's tolerance and New England's prohibition. Quakers in Pennsylvania officially disapproved of gambling, but were less aggressive in enforcing prohibitions than Puritans. New York, with its Dutch heritage and commercial orientation, was relatively permissive. The diversity of colonial attitudes toward gambling prefigured the state-by-state variation in gambling laws that would characterize America throughout its history. One form of gambling that even Puritan colonies accepted was the lottery. Lotteries were seen as different from other gambling because they served public purposes. Colonial governments used lotteries to raise funds for infrastructure, military needs, and public buildings. Harvard, Yale, and other colonial colleges used lottery proceeds to fund construction. Even churches, otherwise opposed to gambling, sometimes used raffles and lotteries to raise money. The cognitive dissonance of condemning gambling while using it for fundraising was resolved by distinguishing lotteries from other forms of gambling, a distinction that remains influential in American gambling law today. Native American gambling traditions predated European arrival by thousands of years. Many Native American tribes had games of chance that served social, religious, and recreational functions. Dice games using marked bones or stones, guessing games, and various sports where spectators wagered on outcomes were common across Native American cultures. Some tribes used gambling as a form of conflict resolution, settling disputes through games rather than violence. The impact of European gambling on Native Americans was largely negative. While Native Americans had their own gambling traditions, European-style gambling often came with alcohol and created economic problems in communities not prepared for such intense commercial gambling. The stereotype of the drunken Indian gambler, while racist and oversimplified, reflected real problems when European vice met Native American populations. The historical irony that Native American casinos would become major economic engines in the late 20th century is striking. African slaves brought their own cultural traditions to America, and these likely included forms of gambling, though the historical record is limited. Enslaved peoples had few resources and little free time, but they found ways to gamble when possible. After emancipation, gambling would become more visible in African American communities, often in segregated venues, since mainstream gambling establishments excluded Black Americans. As the American colonies matured and then won independence, gambling evolved with the nation. The Revolutionary period saw continued use of lotteries to fund the war effort. George Washington himself participated in lotteries and apparently enjoyed card games, though he disapproved of excessive gambling. Thomas Jefferson defended gambling on libertarian grounds, arguing that people should be free to risk their own money. The Founding Fathers' varied attitudes toward gambling reflected the broader American ambivalence that persists today. The 19th century brought the golden age of American frontier gambling. As settlers moved westward, gambling moved with them, often ahead of them. The frontier was a place where traditional social constraints were weak, where men outnumbered women, where violence was common, and where sudden wealth from gold strikes or land speculation made fortunes as quickly as they were lost. It was ideal territory for gambling. Riverboat gambling on the Mississippi and other American rivers became legendary. From the 1820s through the Civil War, paddle-wheel steamboats carried passengers and cargo along America's inland waterways. These boats also carried professional gamblers, men who made their living separating travelers from their money through card games, dice, and various confidence schemes. The riverboat gambler, dressed in fine clothes and skilled at cards, became an iconic American figure, romanticized in literature and later in film. The reality of riverboat gambling was often less romantic than the legend. Many professional gamblers were cheats, using marked cards, loaded dice, and various sleight-of-hand techniques to ensure they won. Disputes over gambling debts frequently led to violence. Steamboat captains sometimes had gamblers thrown overboard, literally, when their cheating became too blatant, or when passengers complained too loudly. The combination of gambling, alcohol, armed men, and confined spaces made riverboats dangerous places. The most popular game among riverboat gamblers was poker, that quintessentially American game that combined chance, skill, and psychology. Poker evolved from earlier European card games, particularly the French game poker, but developed its distinctive character in America. The game spread along the rivers and into frontier towns, becoming America's national card game. Unlike European card games that emphasize trick-taking or banking against the house, poker was a player versus player game where psychology, bluffing, and reading opponents were as important as the cards dealt. Frontier towns during the gold rush and settlement periods were wide-open gambling venues. Saloons in towns like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood offered gambling alongside drinking and prostitution. These establishments were often the only entertainment in isolated communities, and they attracted everyone from cowboys to prospectors to outlaws. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone occurred partly because of disputes related to gambling and other vice activities. Professional gamblers in the Old West ranged from skilled card players who made honest livings through superior play to outright cheats and confidence men. Some became legendary figures. Doc Holliday, the dentist-turned-gambler who fought alongside Wyatt Earp, was a skilled poker and faro player. Wild Bill Hickok, the lawman and gunfighter, was shot while playing poker, reportedly holding aces and eights, forever after known as the dead man's hand. These figures, part fact and part legend, embodied the romantic American association of gambling with the frontier spirit. Women's participation in frontier gambling was limited, but not absent. Some women worked as dealers or as house players in saloons, though this was considered disreputable work that marked a woman as part of the demi-monde. A few women became successful gamblers in their own right, though they had to navigate a male-dominated world that was often hostile to female participation. Poker Alice, Madame Moustache, and other legendary female gamblers probably had their exploits exaggerated in retellings, but they represented real women who found freedom and profit at the gambling tables. The Civil War temporarily disrupted some patterns of American gambling while intensifying others. Soldiers on both sides gambled extensively in camps between battles. Card games and dice helped pass the time during the long periods of boredom that characterized military life. Officers sometimes tried to suppress gambling among troops, fearing it damaged morale and discipline, but with limited success. The war spread gambling habits as men from different regions encountered different games and carried them home after the conflict. After the Civil War, American gambling entered a new phase. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, transformed the West from frontier to settled territory. Towns became cities, territorial governments became states, and pressure to suppress vice activities, including gambling, increased. The late 19th century saw growing reform movements that targeted gambling, prostitution, and alcohol. These movements, often led by women's organizations and religious groups, achieved varying levels of success in different regions, yet gambling continued, often driven underground by prohibition but never eliminated. Private gambling clubs, illegal casinos, and poker games in back rooms flourished in American cities, even where gambling was officially banned. The pattern of prohibition creating criminal enterprises that provided forbidden services, a pattern that would reach its apex during alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, was already evident in gambling prohibition. When legitimate businesses could not offer gambling legally, criminal organizations gladly filled the void. By the early 20th century, American gambling was largely illegal, but widely practiced. Most states had prohibited most forms of gambling, though lotteries persisted in some places and horse racing remained legal in many jurisdictions. The conflict between law and practice, between moral ideal and human behavior, between prohibition and pragmatic regulation, would define American gambling throughout the 20th century. The story would reach its climax in a Nevada desert, in a city that would become synonymous with gambling itself. But before we travel to Las Vegas, we must explore the European gambling culture. that was simultaneously developing its own institutions and traditions, particularly in the glamorous casinos that would come to define sophisticated gambling. The rise of casino culture, Monte Carlo to Las Vegas, 19th century saw gambling transform from informal games in taverns and homes to elegant entertainment in purpose-built casinos. These grand gambling palaces, with their chandeliers and evening dress requirements, their roulette wheels and baccarat tables, represented gambling's attempt to shed its disreputable image and become respectable, even glamorous. The story of modern casino culture begins in Europe, reaches its pinnacle in Monte Carlo, crosses the Atlantic to America, and finds its ultimate expression in Las Vegas. It is a story of entrepreneurship and organized crime, of architectural splendor and human desperation, of mathematics and psychology, of fortunes won and lost in rooms designed specifically for that purpose. The European casino tradition, as we have seen, began in Venice with the Ridotto in 1638. But this was a seasonal operation during Carnival, not a permanent establishment. The first true casino in the modern sense was probably the Casino di Venezia, which opened in a different form and evolved into a permanent gambling establishment. Other Italian and German spa towns also established casinos in the 18th and early 19th centuries, usually in connection with mineral baths and health resorts. The rationale for these early casinos was that gambling was acceptable entertainment for wealthy visitors taking the waters at health resorts. The spa casino model spread throughout Europe during the 19th century. Baden-Baden in Germany became particularly famous, attracting European aristocracy and wealthy travelers to its elegant casino and thermal baths. The casino was not just a gambling venue, but a social center where Europe's elite could meet, network and see and be seen. But the casino that would define the genre, that would become synonymous with elegance and high-stakes gambling, was the Casino de Monte Carlo, opened in 1863 in the tiny Principality of Monaco. Monte Carlo's story begins with desperation. The ruling Grimaldi family faced bankruptcy as Monaco's traditional industries of fishing and agriculture provided insufficient revenue for a modern state. Prince Charles III decided on a desperate gamble himself: create a casino so attractive that wealthy Europeans would flock to Monaco, filling the principality's coffers with gambling revenue. The prince granted a monopoly gambling concession to French entrepreneur François Blanc, who had previously operated successful casinos in Germany. Blanc was a visionary who understood that a successful casino required more than just gaming tables. He spent lavishly on infrastructure, building roads and hotels, creating gardens and entertainment venues. In 1878, the Casino de Monte Carlo itself opened in a building of extraordinary architectural beauty, designed by Charles Garnier, the architect of the Paris Opera. The Monte Carlo Casino was palatial. Its rooms featured Belle Époque architecture, with ornate decoration, frescoes, sculptures, and the finest materials. The gaming rooms had names that evoked luxury: the Salon Europe, the Salon des Grâces. The atmosphere was one of refined elegance, as far removed from frontier saloons as possible. Men wore tuxedos, women wore evening gowns, and the dress code was strictly enforced. This was gambling as high culture, as sophisticated entertainment for the discerning elite. The games offered at Monte Carlo were primarily European casino standards: roulette, 30 et 40, and baccarat. Roulette, the iconic casino game with its spinning wheel and bouncing ball, was Monte Carlo's signature game. The casino used the single zero European roulette wheel, which offered better odds than the double zero American wheel that would become standard in American casinos. This mathematical advantage for players, combined with the glamorous setting, made Monte Carlo roulette legendary. Monte Carlo's success exceeded all expectations. Wealthy Europeans did indeed flock to Monaco to gamble. The casino's revenues were so substantial that in 1869, Prince Charles abolished income tax for Monaco's residents, a policy that continues today and has made Monaco a tax haven for the wealthy. The tiny principality transformed from impoverished backwater to playground of the rich, all based on gambling revenue. It was a model that other jurisdictions would attempt to replicate throughout the following century. The cultural impact of Monte Carlo extended far beyond Monaco. The casino featured in novels, operas, and films. It became synonymous with a certain kind of glamorous, dangerous lifestyle. Stories circulated about Russian nobles losing fortunes at the tables, about suicides in the gardens after devastating losses, about master gamblers breaking the bank. Many of these stories were exaggerated or invented, but they created a powerful mythology around Monte Carlo that attracted even more visitors. Monte Carlo also attracted professional gamblers and card sharps, who saw opportunity in the concentration of wealthy gamblers. Charles de Ville-Wells, a conman and gambler, famously broke the bank at Monte Carlo in 1891, winning enough money to exhaust the reserves at one table. His success was probably due to luck rather than skill or cheating, but it inspired the popular song "The Man Who Broke the Bank at Monte Carlo," which spread the casino's fame worldwide. Wells eventually lost everything he had won and ended his life in poverty, a cautionary tale about gambling's fickle nature. The success of Monte Carlo inspired imitators across Europe and beyond. Other spa towns and resorts established casinos hoping to replicate Monaco's success. Some, like Baden-Baden and Deauville in France, achieved moderate success. Others failed to attract sufficient clientele. The casino business proved more difficult than it appeared. Location, management, capital, and reputation all had to align perfectly for a casino to succeed. In America, the situation was more complicated. By the late 19th century, gambling was illegal in most American states, but prohibition created opportunity for those willing to operate illegally. Underground casinos operated in major American cities, often with police protection purchased through bribes. These illegal establishments ranged from crude backroom operations to elegant clubs that rivaled European casinos in luxury, if not in legitimacy. New York had particularly notorious illegal gambling in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Richard Canfield operated luxurious gambling houses that attracted wealthy New Yorkers, despite their illegal status. Canfield's establishments featured expensive furnishings, gourmet food, and impeccable service. Players gambled for enormous stakes at faro, roulette, and other games. Canfield's success demonstrated that in America, as in Europe, there was a market for elegant, high-stakes gambling, even when illegal. But the future of American casino gambling lay not in the East, but in the West, specifically in Nevada. Nevada had been a frontier territory during the 19th century, and gambling had been part of frontier life. When Nevada achieved statehood in 1864, gambling remained legal. But as progressive reform movements gained strength in the early 20th century, pressure to prohibit gambling increased. In 1909, Nevada bowed to this pressure and outlawed gambling, joining most other states. The prohibition lasted only 20 years. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, devastated Nevada's economy. Mining, the state's traditional industry, collapsed. Population declined as people left to seek opportunity elsewhere. Desperate for revenue and economic activity, Nevada reconsidered its gambling prohibition. In 1931, the state legislature legalized gambling again, not just tolerating it, but embracing it as an economic development strategy. This decision, made during desperation, would transform Nevada and ultimately reshape global gambling culture. Initially, legalization changed little. Small casinos opened in Reno and other Nevada towns, but they were modest operations serving locals and occasional tourists. The games were often crooked, the atmosphere more frontier saloon than Monte Carlo elegance. Nevada gambling remained a minor regional curiosity through the 1930s. Then came Las Vegas, and everything changed. Las Vegas in the early 20th century was a small railroad town in the Mojave Desert, hot, isolated, and unremarkable. It had a few thousand residents and no particular reason to grow, but several factors converged to create opportunity. The construction of Hoover Dam in the 1930s brought thousands of workers to the region, creating a local economy. The legalization of gambling in 1931 created opportunity for casino development. And the town's location, though remote, was close enough to Los Angeles that it could potentially attract Southern California tourists. The first casinos in Las Vegas were small downtown establishments, little different from those in Reno. But one man saw a grander vision. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a mobster from New York with connections to organized crime syndicates, imagined a luxury casino resort in Las Vegas that would rival Monte Carlo. In 1946, he opened the Flamingo, a lavish hotel casino on the strip of highway outside downtown Las Vegas. The Flamingo was revolutionary. It was not just a casino, but a complete resort, with hotel rooms, restaurants, showrooms for entertainment, swimming pools, and gardens. The idea was that visitors would come for a complete vacation experience, of which gambling was just one part. The casino was elegant by Las Vegas standards, though it could not match European sophistication. But the combination of legality, luxury, and desert exoticism was compelling. Siegel's vision was correct, but his execution was flawed. The Flamingo initially struggled financially, partly due to cost overruns during construction and partly due to operational problems. Siegel's mob investors grew impatient with losses. In 1947, Siegel was murdered, probably by his own associates, in a killing that became legendary in mob lore. But the Flamingo survived under new management and eventually became profitable. More importantly, it established the model that Las Vegas would follow. Throughout the 1950s, Las Vegas boomed. New casinos opened on the Strip, each trying to outdo previous establishments in size and spectacle. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, the Dunes, each had its own theme and attractions. Entertainment became crucial to the Las Vegas model. Casinos hired the biggest stars of the day: Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Elvis Presley, to perform in their showrooms, drawing crowds who would also gamble. The combination of gambling, entertainment, and a certain outlaw glamour made Las Vegas uniquely appealing. Organized crime was deeply involved in early Las Vegas. Mobsters from various syndicates owned or controlled many casinos. They used Las Vegas to launder money from illegal activities and to generate legitimate income from gambling. The mob brought sophistication to casino operations, using techniques they had developed running illegal gambling in other cities. They also brought violence, and Las Vegas in the 1950s and 1960s had a dangerous underside beneath its glamorous surface. The mob's control of Las Vegas attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement and government. Federal investigations in the 1960s threatened to shut down casinos with mob connections, which was most of them. Nevada faced a dilemma. Gambling was the foundation of its economy, but it was also corrupted by organized crime. The solution came through corporate ownership. Beginning in the late 1960s, corporations began buying Las Vegas casinos from mob owners. Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire, purchased several casinos, providing a veneer of legitimacy. This transition from mob to corporate ownership transformed Las Vegas over the following decades. The 1970s and 1980s saw Las Vegas evolve into a mainstream tourist destination. The older casinos were supplemented and sometimes replaced by massive resort complexes. The MGM Grand, Caesar's Palace, the Mirage. These mega-resorts had thousands of hotel rooms, multiple restaurants, shopping malls, convention facilities, and of course enormous casinos. Las Vegas shed some of its outlaw image and marketed itself to families and convention attendees as well as to gamblers. By the 1990s, Las Vegas had become the casino capital of the world, surpassing Monte Carlo and all other gambling destinations in size and revenue. The city had created a unique gambling culture that combined casino games with elaborate theming, spectacle, and entertainment. The Egyptian-themed Luxor, the medieval Excalibur, the tropical Mirage with its volcano, the Venetian with its replica of Venice, complete with gondolas. These were not just casinos, but complete fantasy environments. Las Vegas had mastered the art of creating immersive experiences that kept visitors gambling longer and spending more. Atlantic City provided a different model of casino legalization in America. In 1976, New Jersey voters approved a referendum allowing casinos in Atlantic City, which had been a declining beach resort. The first casino, Resorts International, opened in 1978. Other casinos followed quickly. Atlantic City's proximity to New York and Philadelphia gave it access to massive East Coast markets. For a time in the 1980s, Atlantic City rivaled Las Vegas in gambling revenue. But Atlantic City faced challenges Las Vegas did not. State regulations were more restrictive, limiting operational flexibility. The city itself remained troubled, with poverty and decay outside the casino areas. Unlike Las Vegas, which built a complete tourist infrastructure, Atlantic City remained focused primarily on gambling, attracting day trippers rather than multi-day resort visitors. By the 2000s, Atlantic City was struggling as regional competition increased and visitors had more choices. Native American casino gambling emerged as another major force in American gambling in the late 20th century. A 1987 Supreme Court decision and the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act created a framework for tribes to operate casinos on reservation land. Many tribes seeking economic development on reservations that often lacked other opportunities embraced casino gambling. By the 2000s, tribal casinos across America were generating tens of billions of dollars annually, providing employment and revenue for Native American communities. The casino model had proven enormously successful, spreading from Monaco to Las Vegas to tribal reservations to countries around the world. Macau, a former Portuguese colony in China, legalized casino gambling and by the 2000s had surpassed Las Vegas in gambling revenue, driven by Chinese gamblers. Singapore opened massive casino resorts. Australia, South Africa, South Korea, and numerous other countries established casinos. The elegant Monte Carlo model had been combined with the Las Vegas approach of massive scale and complete resort experience, creating a global casino industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet for all their size and sophistication, casinos still operated on the same basic principles as ancient dice games. The house held mathematical advantages in most games, ensuring long-term profitability. Players sought entertainment, excitement, and the chance of winning against the odds. The psychology of gambling, the thrill of risk and the pain of loss, remained unchanged. The casino was just a more elaborate venue for the same human drama that had played out over dice and cards for millennia. The specific games that casinos offered had their own fascinating histories, evolving over centuries from simple beginnings to complex modern forms. To understand casinos fully, we must understand the games themselves, their origins, their mathematics, and their hold on human imagination. The next chapter of our journey takes us deeper into the games that made casino gambling possible and irresistible. Games of chance, evolution and innovation. Games we play in modern casinos are the products of centuries of evolution, each with its own history and logic. Some, like roulette, were deliberately invented. Others, like blackjack, evolved from earlier games. Still others, like slot machines, were enabled by technological innovation. Together, these games form the core of casino gambling, each offering different experiences, different odds, and different appeals to different players. Understanding these games is understanding gambling itself, the eternal human desire to challenge fate and perhaps, just perhaps, come out ahead. Roulette is perhaps the most iconic casino game. Its spinning wheel and bouncing ball instantly recognizable symbols of gambling. The game's name comes from the French word for little wheel, and indeed, France was crucial to roulette's development, though its origins are disputed. Some historians credit Blaise Pascal with inventing roulette accidentally, while working on a perpetual motion machine in the 17th century. This story is probably apocryphal, but it makes thematic sense that the mathematician who pioneered probability theory would also invent a game of pure chance. More likely, roulette evolved from earlier wheel-based games popular in Italy and France in the 18th century. The modern roulette wheel, with its numbered pockets, alternating red and black colors, and green zero, was probably developed in France around 1790. The game quickly became popular in Parisian casinos during the French Revolution and Napoleonic era. From there, it spread throughout Europe, becoming particularly associated with Monte Carlo in the 19th century. The roulette wheel's design is deceptively complex. The numbers from 1 to 36 are arranged in a specific order that distributes high and low numbers, odd and even numbers, and red and black pockets as evenly as possible around the wheel. The zero pocket, colored green, belongs to the house, creating the casino's mathematical advantage. European roulette has a single zero, giving the house an edge of 2.7%. American roulette adds a second zero, increasing the house edge to 5.26%. This seemingly small difference significantly impacts players' expected losses over time. Roulette's appeal lies in its simplicity and its variety of betting options. Players can bet on single numbers, combinations of numbers, colors, odd or even, high or low. Each bet has different odds and different payouts. Some players develop elaborate betting systems, trying to beat the game through patterns of bets. The martingale system, where players double their bets after each loss, is famous. But no betting system can overcome the house edge in the long run. The mathematics are inexorable. Over enough spins, the house advantage guarantees casino profit. Yet roulette remains popular because of its theatrical appeal. The spin of the wheel, the release of the ball, the anticipation as it bounces from pocket to pocket. These create drama and suspense. When the ball lands and winners are determined, there is a collective emotional moment that few other games provide. Roulette is communal gambling, where a group of players shares in the experience, even though they are competing against the house, not each other. Blackjack, known in casinos as 21, offers a very different experience. Unlike roulette, blackjack is a game of skill as well as chance. The basic game is simple. Players try to get cards totaling as close to 21 as possible without going over, while beating the dealer's total. Cards 2 through 10 are worth their face value, face cards are worth 10, and aces can be worth 1 or 11. Players make decisions about whether to take another card, hit, or keep their current total, stand. The game evolved from earlier European card games, particularly the French 21, 21, and the Spanish game of 21. These games came to America, probably through French and Spanish colonies, and evolved into modern blackjack. The name blackjack refers to a special bonus that used to be paid when a player's first two cards were the ace of spades and either the jack of spades or jack of clubs, a blackjack. Though this special bonus is no longer offered in most casinos, the name stuck. What makes blackjack unique is that skilled players can reduce the house edge to less than 1% through optimal play. Basic strategy, derived from mathematical analysis of all possible card combinations, tells players the correct decision in every situation. A player using basic strategy perfectly will lose only slightly more often than they win, making blackjack one of the most player-friendly casino games. This is why blackjack became the most popular table game in American casinos. But blackjack's skill element also enables something casinos hate: card counting. In the 1960s, mathematicians and gamblers realized that by tracking which cards have been played, players can determine when the remaining deck is favorable and increase their bets accordingly. The most famous card counting system, the high-low count, assigns values to cards and requires the counter to maintain a running mental total. When the count is high, meaning many low cards have been played and the remaining deck is rich in high cards, the player has an edge and should bet more. Card counting works because blackjack has memory. Unlike roulette, where each spin is independent, in blackjack, the composition of the remaining deck affects future hands. If the deck has disproportionately many aces and 10-value cards remaining, the player is more likely to get blackjack and the dealer is more likely to bust. A card counter exploits this by betting small when the deck is unfavorable and large when it is favorable. Over time, this can give the player a small but real edge over the house. Casinos responded to card counting in various ways. They began using multiple decks shuffled together, making counting more difficult. They shuffled more frequently, cutting off hands before favorable situations could be fully exploited. They trained dealers and pit bosses to recognize counters and had them barred from play. Some casinos even used violence against suspected counters in the early days, though this became legally and socially unacceptable. The battle between card counters and casinos continues today, an arms race of technique and counter-technique. The story of the MIT blackjack team became legendary in gambling culture. In the 1980s and 1990s, a group of MIT students and alumni formed a team that used card counting and team play to win millions of dollars from casinos. They used sophisticated techniques including spotters, who played at multiple tables and signaled when the count was favorable, and big players, who would then join the table and make large bets. The team's success inspired books and films and proved that intelligent, disciplined players could beat casinos at their own game. Slot machines represent a completely different gambling experience. Unlike table games, slots are solitary activities requiring no skill and offering no decisions. Players simply insert money, press a button or pull a lever, and watch symbols spin. If the symbols align in winning combinations, the player wins. If not, they lose. The simplicity is part of the appeal, but so is the possibility of enormous jackpots from small bets. The first slot machine was invented by Charles Fay in San Francisco in 1894. Fay's Liberty Bell machine had 3 reels with 5 symbols each: horseshoes, diamonds, spades, hearts, and a cracked Liberty Bell. When 3 Liberty Bells lined up, the machine paid out 50 cents, the maximum prize. The machine was entirely mechanical, using springs and gears to spin the reels and determine outcomes. Fay's invention was revolutionary. Previous gambling machines existed, but none combined simplicity, automation, and player appeal as effectively as the Liberty Bell. The machine was an immediate success in San Francisco saloons and quickly spread to other cities. Other inventors and manufacturers created variations, improving on Fay's design and adding new features. By the early 20th century, slot machines were common in bars, cigar stores, and bowling alleys across America. The machines faced constant legal challenges. Since they were clearly gambling devices, they were illegal in jurisdictions that prohibited gambling. Manufacturers responded with various strategies. Some machines dispensed gum or mints as prizes instead of coins, claiming they were vending machines, not gambling devices. The fruit symbols still used in many slot machines today originated from machines that supposedly dispensed fruit-flavored gum. The bar symbol represents a logo from the Bell Fruit Gum Company. These transparent fictions allowed machines to operate even where gambling was illegal. When Nevada legalized gambling in 1931, slot machines became legal gambling devices in casinos. They were initially treated as minor sidelines, mere diversions while players waited for seats at table games. But casino operators noticed something interesting. Slots were profitable far beyond their floor space. A single slot machine, occupying just a few square feet and requiring minimal staff attention, could generate substantial revenue. As casinos expanded their slot machine offerings, revenue increased proportionally. The technology of slot machines evolved dramatically in the 20th century. Electric machines, introduced in the 1960s, offered more complex games with more pay lines and larger jackpots. Video slots, appearing in the 1970s, replaced physical reels with computerized displays. allowing for even more complexity. By the 1990s, slots had become the dominant form of casino gambling, generating more revenue than all table games combined. Modern slot machines are sophisticated computers running complex programs. The spinning reels players see are just display devices. The outcome is determined by a random number generator, a computer chip that produces numbers continuously. When a player presses the button, the current number determines where the reels will stop. The randomness is genuine, though the probabilities are carefully programmed to ensure the house edge. Modern slots can offer life-changing jackpots. Progressive machines can accumulate prize pools worth millions, and the variety of themes and features is limited only by imagination. The psychology of slot machines is fascinating and troubling. The machines are designed to maximize player engagement and spending. The near-miss effect, where symbols stop just above or below a winning line, creates the illusion that the player almost won, encouraging continued play. The sounds and lights accompanying wins, even small wins that are less than the amount bet, create positive reinforcement. The variable ratio reinforcement schedule, where wins are unpredictable but occasional, is the most addictive pattern in behavioral psychology. Slot machines exploit this mercilessly. Poker deserves special consideration as perhaps the most complex and skill-based casino game. Unlike other casino games where players bet against the house, in poker players bet against each other. The casino merely provides the venue and dealers, taking a small percentage of each pot as its fee. This structure means that skilled players can consistently profit at poker, not by beating the house, but by beating weaker players. Poker evolved from various European card games in 18th and 19th century America. The game we recognize today, with its 5-card hands, betting rounds, and community cards, developed gradually through the 19th century. Texas Hold'em, now the most popular variant, emerged in Texas in the early 20th century and spread throughout the South. But it remained relatively obscure until the 1970s, when the World Series of Poker, established in 1970, helped popularize the game. The poker boom of the 2000s transformed the game from a casino obscurity into a global phenomenon. Several factors converged. The whole card camera, invented in 1999, allowed television broadcasts to show players' hidden cards, making poker dramatically more interesting to watch. Online poker sites, which exploded in popularity in the early 2000s, allowed millions of people to learn poker and play from home. And in 2003, an amateur player named Chris Moneymaker won the World Series of Poker main event after qualifying through an online satellite tournament, proving that anyone could compete and win. Poker requires a combination of mathematical skills, psychological insight, and discipline that makes it unique among gambling games. Good players must calculate pot odds and implied odds, must read opponents' behavior for tells, must manage bankroll to survive inevitable losing streaks, and must control emotions to avoid tilt, the destructive mental state where losses lead to reckless play. Professional poker players exist who make consistent livings from the game, something impossible in games of pure chance. The mathematics of poker are complex. Unlike games where outcomes are determined by physical randomness like dice or roulette wheels, poker outcomes depend on card distributions, betting patterns, and player decisions. Calculating the probability of improving a hand, comparing that to the pot odds being offered, and deciding whether to call, fold, or raise requires mathematical thinking. Game theory optimal play, a concept from mathematical game theory, has revolutionized high-level poker in recent years. But poker is also deeply psychological. Bluffing, representing a stronger hand than one actually holds to make opponents fold, is poker's most famous strategic element. Reading opponents, detecting when they are bluffing or when they have strong hands, requires observation and interpretation of subtle behavioral cues. Managing one's own demeanor to avoid giving away information requires self-control and self-awareness. The mental game of poker is as important as the mathematical game. These games, from roulette's elegant simplicity to poker's psychological complexity, represent the diversity of gambling experiences. Each appeals to different player preferences and personalities. Some want pure luck and quick resolution. Others want skill and strategic depth. Some want solitary play. Others want social interaction. The variety ensures that almost everyone can find some form of gambling that appeals to them. And that variety, combined with the universal human attraction to risk and reward, ensures that gambling will remain popular regardless of moral disapproval or legal restriction. But that popularity comes with costs, individual and social, that we must now confront directly. The dark side, addiction, crime, and regulation. The history of gambling is not only stories of entertainment and fortune, it is also a history of addiction, of lives destroyed, of crime and corruption, of families broken and communities damaged. To tell the story of gambling honestly requires acknowledging these harms, understanding their causes, and examining society's attempts to mitigate them through regulation and treatment. The dark side of gambling is as old as gambling itself, and no history would be complete without confronting it directly. Gambling addiction, today recognized as a psychological disorder, has been observed throughout history. The gambler's lament from ancient India, which we encountered earlier, describes compulsive gambling with remarkable psychological insight. The gambler knows he is destroying his life, alienating his family, ruining himself financially, yet cannot stop. He returns to the dice again and again, compelled by forces he cannot control. This pattern of compulsive behavior, despite negative consequences, defines addiction, and it has been associated with gambling for thousands of years. Modern neuroscience has revealed why gambling can be addictive. The brain's reward system, particularly the release of dopamine, responds strongly to gambling wins. But crucially, it also responds to near misses and to the anticipation of possible wins. This means that gambling stimulates the reward system even when the gambler is losing, creating reinforcement for continued play. The variable ratio reinforcement schedule of gambling, where rewards are unpredictable but occasional, is the most powerful pattern for creating persistent behavior in both animals and humans. Slot machines, as we noted, are particularly designed to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities. But other forms of gambling can also be addictive. Sports betting, poker, even lottery tickets have addicted people. The common factor is not the specific game, but the underlying psychological pattern, the compulsive need to gamble despite harmful consequences. The prevalence of gambling addiction in the general population is debated, with estimates ranging from 1% to 3% of adults meeting criteria for gambling disorder, the clinical term for gambling addiction. This may seem like a small percentage, but it represents millions of people. And for each person with a gambling disorder, there are typically family members, friends, and others who are affected by that person's gambling. The social cost of gambling addiction is substantial. Treatment for gambling addiction has evolved significantly in recent decades. Gamblers Anonymous, founded in 1957 and modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous, provides peer support for people trying to quit gambling. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps patients recognize and change thought patterns that drive compulsive gambling, has proven effective. Medications that affect dopamine or serotonin systems show promise, but treatment remains challenging and relapse rates are high. Many people with gambling problems never seek treatment, either because they do not recognize they have a problem or because they are ashamed. The relationship between gambling and crime is complex and troubling. Organized crime has been involved in gambling throughout modern history, both in running illegal gambling operations and in controlling legal gambling venues. The mob's role in Las Vegas has already been discussed, but organized crime's involvement in gambling extends far beyond Nevada. Illegal bookmaking, underground casinos, numbers rackets. These enterprises have funded organized crime for over a century. Individual gamblers sometimes turn to crime to finance their habit or pay their debts. Embezzlement, fraud, theft, these crimes are overrepresented among problem gamblers. The desperation of gambling addiction can drive people who would never otherwise commit crimes to steal from employers, family members, or anyone they can victimize. The human tragedy of these crimes affects both the gamblers themselves and their victims. Money laundering through casinos is another criminal concern. Casinos handle enormous amounts of cash, making them attractive venues for washing illegal money. Criminals can exchange drug money or other criminal proceeds for casino chips, gamble modestly, and then exchange chips back for clean casino checks. Despite anti-money laundering regulations, casinos remain vulnerable to this abuse. Match fixing in sports, where athletes or officials manipulate game outcomes to benefit gamblers, is enabled by gambling on sports. The incentive for corruption exists whenever large sums are bet on sports outcomes. While most athletes and officials are honest, the temptation of gambling money has corrupted some. Sports leagues and gambling regulators work to prevent match fixing, but the problem persists wherever sports betting is popular. Society's attempts to regulate gambling reflect ongoing tension between prohibition and legalization, between protecting people from harm and respecting individual freedom. Different societies at different times have tried various approaches, none entirely successful. Complete prohibition was the approach in many societies for long periods. In America, most gambling was illegal for most of the 20th century. The rationale was straightforward. Gambling causes harm, therefore it should be prohibited. This paternalistic approach assumed government should protect people from their own bad decisions. And indeed, prohibition did reduce gambling compared to what would have occurred if it were legal. But prohibition also created problems. It drove gambling underground, where it was unregulated and often connected to organized crime. It made criminals of ordinary people who wanted to gamble. It deprived government of potential tax revenue. It created enforcement costs as police pursued gamblers and bookmakers instead of more serious criminals. And it never actually stopped gambling, merely changed where and how it occurred. These problems led many jurisdictions to reconsider prohibition. Legalization with regulation became the alternative approach. By bringing gambling out of the shadows, government could regulate it, tax it, and potentially mitigate some of its harms. This has been the trend in recent decades, with more jurisdictions legalizing various forms of gambling while imposing regulations meant to protect players. And society. Modern gambling regulation varies widely across jurisdictions but typically includes some common elements. Licensing requirements ensure only approved operators can offer gambling. Age restrictions prohibit minors from gambling. Self-exclusion programs allow problem gamblers to ban themselves from casinos. Advertising restrictions limit how gambling can be marketed. Problem gambling resources, often funded by gambling taxes or license fees, provide treatment for those who develop problems. And oversight bodies monitor compliance with all these regulations. The effectiveness of these regulations is debated. Supporters argue that regulated legal gambling is better than unregulated illegal gambling, that it provides entertainment for millions while channeling money to government rather than criminals, and that modern regulations genuinely help reduce harm. Critics counter that legalization inevitably increases gambling, and thus increases gambling-related problems, that regulations are often inadequate and poorly enforced, and that government becomes dependent on gambling revenue and thus has perverse incentives to encourage gambling rather than discourage it. This debate has no easy resolution. Both sides have valid points. Legal gambling does generate tax revenue and eliminate some problems associated with illegal gambling. But it also does create more gambling and more gambling problems than prohibition would. The question ultimately is one of values. What balance between individual freedom and collective welfare do we want? Different societies answer differently, and the answer changes over time as social attitudes evolve. One particularly interesting regulatory challenge involves online gambling, which has exploded in popularity since the late 1990s and raises unique problems. How do you regulate gambling that crosses international borders? How do you protect minors when gambling is accessible from home computers and smartphones? How do you prevent money laundering when transactions are purely electronic? These questions have bedeviled regulators worldwide and remain largely unsolved. The future of gambling regulation will likely involve ongoing experimentation with different approaches. Some jurisdictions will maintain prohibition, others will liberalize further. Some will regulate strictly, others more loosely. Over time, evidence will accumulate about what works and what doesn't, and best practices may emerge. But given the long history of society struggling to regulate gambling without succeeding in either eliminating it or making it harmless, we should not expect easy answers. As we have seen, the dark side of gambling is real and substantial. Addiction, crime, and various social costs must be weighed against gambling's benefits of entertainment, revenue, and individual freedom. How societies balance these factors shapes their gambling policies. In the digital age now upon us, these questions take on new dimensions and urgency. The transformation of gambling by internet technology is the most recent chapter in gambling's long history, and it may be the most consequential. The digital revolution. Online gambling and beyond. The internet has transformed gambling more profoundly than any innovation since the invention of playing cards. In just 3 decades, online gambling has evolved from a technological curiosity to a global industry generating over $60 billion annually. It has made gambling accessible from anywhere at any time, eliminated the need for physical casinos, created new games impossible in physical form, and raised regulatory challenges that governments are still struggling to address. The digital revolution in gambling is still underway, and its ultimate implications remain uncertain. The first online casinos appeared in the mid-1990s, shortly after the World Wide Web became publicly accessible. In 1994, the Caribbean nation of Antigua and Barbuda passed legislation allowing companies to apply for licenses to offer online gambling. In 1996, InterCasino launched, often cited as the first true online casino. The technology was primitive by today's standards, with slow connections, basic graphics, and limited game selection, but it proved the concept. People would gamble online if given the opportunity. Early online gambling faced skepticism from both players and regulators. Players worried about fairness. How could they trust a computer program in a server somewhere to deal cards fairly? How did they know the online casino wouldn't simply steal their deposits? Regulators worried about jurisdiction. If an online casino was based in one country but accepted players from another, whose laws applied? How could gambling be enforced when it existed only in cyberspace? Despite these concerns, online gambling grew explosively. By the early 2000s, hundreds of online casinos operated, most based in jurisdictions with favorable regulatory environments like Gibraltar, Malta, or various Caribbean islands. These offshore casinos served players worldwide, including from countries where gambling was illegal. The internet's global nature made enforcement of national gambling laws extremely difficult. A player in the United States could easily access a casino based in Antigua, making American gambling prohibition largely ineffective. Online poker drove much of the early growth. Poker is ideally suited to internet play because it involves competition between players rather than against the house. Online poker rooms could host many tables simultaneously, offering games at all stakes and skill levels around the clock. Players could multi-table, playing at several tables simultaneously, something impossible in physical casinos. The convenience and variety attracted players who would never have visited a brick-and-mortar poker room. The poker boom of 2003 to 2006, as we mentioned earlier, was largely an online phenomenon. Chris Moneymaker's World Series of Poker victory in 2003, after qualifying online, inspired millions to try online poker. Sites like PokerStars, Party Poker, and Full Tilt Poker grew enormously, hosting millions of players and billions of dollars in wagers. For a few years, Online poker seemed like a gold rush, with skilled players making six-figure incomes and poker rooms generating massive profits. But the regulatory hammer was falling. In 2006, the United States passed the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, which prohibited financial institutions from processing transactions for online gambling. While the law's constitutionality and effectiveness were debated, it had immediate impact. Most major online gambling companies withdrew from the American market, not wanting to risk criminal prosecution. The American online poker boom ended almost overnight. Other countries took different approaches. The United Kingdom, in 2005, passed legislation regulating online gambling rather than prohibiting it. Companies could obtain UK licenses and legally serve British players. This approach provided consumer protections while generating tax revenue. Other European countries adopted similar regulatory frameworks. The European Union generally supported regulated legal online gambling as consistent with free trade principles, though implementation varied by member state. Australia initially allowed online gambling, but later restricted it, permitting sports betting, but prohibiting online casino games and poker. Asian countries generally prohibited online gambling, though enforcement varied. China strictly prohibited it, but couldn't prevent Chinese citizens from accessing offshore sites. The Philippines became a hub for online gambling operations serving Asian markets, creating a substantial industry despite controversial social impacts. The technology of online gambling advanced rapidly. Early sites had simple graphics and limited games. Modern sites feature sophisticated graphics, live dealer games streamed from studios, mobile apps that work seamlessly on smartphones and tablets, and integration with social media. The user experience rivals or exceeds that of physical casinos in many ways, though it lacks the social atmosphere and physical tangibility that some players prefer. Live dealer games, introduced in the mid-2000s, bridged the gap between online and physical gambling. These games use real dealers in studios with multiple cameras capturing the action. Players at home watch the dealer via streaming video and place bets using their computers or phones. The combination of human dealers and internet convenience proved very popular, particularly for games like blackjack, roulette, and baccarat, where players wanted the authenticity of a real dealer. Online gambling raised concerns about problem gambling. The convenience of gambling from home, available 24/7 without leaving the house, made it easy for compulsive gamblers to lose control. The use of electronic money rather than physical cash made losses feel less real. The speed of online gambling, where hundreds of hands or spins could occur per hour, allowed losses to accumulate quickly. Studies suggested that online gambling might be more addictive than traditional gambling, though the evidence remained debated. Regulators responded with various protective measures. Deposit limits allowed players to restrict how much they could deposit in a given time period. Reality checks periodically informed players how long they had been playing. Self-exclusion systems let players ban themselves from all licensed sites. Mandatory problem gambling warnings and links to help resources became standard. Whether these measures significantly reduced problem gambling remained uncertain, but they represented serious attempts to address the issue. The security and fairness of online gambling also improved over time. Random number generators that determined game outcomes were tested by independent auditors. Encryption protected financial transactions. Reputable sites obtained licenses from respected jurisdictions with strong oversight. Player funds were segregated from operational funds to protect against casino insolvency. While some rogue operators still existed, the reputable segment of the industry became reasonably trustworthy. The business model of online gambling differed significantly from physical casinos. Without expensive real estate and large staff, online casinos had much lower costs. This allowed them to offer better odds and larger bonuses to attract players. Competition was intense, with hundreds of sites vying for customers. Marketing became crucial, with sites spending heavily on advertising, affiliate programs, and promotional bonuses. The industry became sophisticated in customer acquisition and retention. using data analytics to optimize every aspect of operations. Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology introduced new possibilities for online gambling in the 2010s. Bitcoin casinos emerged, offering gambling with cryptocurrency rather than traditional money. The advantages included faster transactions, lower fees, and greater anonymity. Blockchain technology also enabled provably fair gambling, where the fairness of each game outcome could be cryptographically verified. Some believed cryptocurrency gambling would revolutionize the industry, though adoption remained limited to a niche market. Social casino games, which emerged in the late 2000s, blurred the line between gambling and gaming. These games, often on social media platforms or mobile apps, used casino game mechanics but did not involve real money. Players used virtual currency, either earned through play or purchased with real money. Winnings were purely virtual and could not be cashed out. This structure technically made social casinos not gambling, even though they looked and felt like gambling. The social casino model proved enormously profitable. Players would spend real money to buy virtual chips, not for the possibility of profit, but simply for entertainment. This willingness to pay for entertainment without hoping for financial return seemed paradoxical, but it worked. Social casinos generated billions in revenue while existing in a legal grey area, not regulated as gambling because no money could be won. Critics argued they served as gateways to real gambling and exploited gambling-like mechanics without consumer protections. Mobile gambling, enabled by smartphones and tablets, became the fastest-growing segment of online gambling in the 2010s. Mobile devices were always with users, making gambling even more accessible than desktop computers. Apps provided streamlined experiences optimized for small screens and touch interfaces. By the late 2010s, mobile gambling generated more revenue than desktop in many markets, reflecting broader shifts in internet usage. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 dramatically accelerated online gambling growth. With physical casinos closed or operating at reduced capacity, gamblers turned to online alternatives. Sports betting, which had been legalizing across America, saw enormous growth as it moved online. The pandemic demonstrated that online gambling could substitute for physical gambling to a significant degree, changing industry perceptions about the relationship between the two. Virtual reality and augmented reality represent the next frontier in online gambling technology. VR casinos, where players wear headsets and enter virtual gambling environments, have been developed but remain niche. The technology creates immersive experiences where users can walk through virtual casinos, sit at virtual tables, and interact with other players' avatars. Whether VR gambling will become mainstream or remain a curiosity depends on technology costs, declining and compelling experiences being created. Artificial intelligence is transforming online gambling in multiple ways. AI powers chatbots that provide customer service. It analyzes player behavior to detect problem gambling or fraud. It optimizes game design and marketing. In poker, AI has reached superhuman levels of play, with systems like Libratus and Pluribus defeating top human professionals. The implications for online poker are profound. If AI can beat any human, how can players trust they are playing against other humans rather than AI bots? The digital revolution in gambling is ongoing, with new technologies and business models constantly emerging. The fundamental activity remains unchanged. People risking money on uncertain outcomes, seeking entertainment, excitement, and the possibility of profit. But the internet has made gambling more accessible, more varied, and more integrated into daily life than ever before. Whether this is progress or cause for concern depends on one's perspective. What is certain is that gambling, having migrated from ancient dice to cyberspace, will continue to evolve in ways we cannot yet imagine. As we approach the present day and look toward the future, one final aspect of modern gambling demands our attention: sports betting, that form of gambling which combines fandom with wagering, which has recently exploded across America and globally, and which represents perhaps the most culturally significant form of gambling today. The modern landscape, sports betting, and global industry. Sports and gambling have been linked since ancient times. Romans bet on chariot races and gladiatorial combat. Medieval Europeans wagered on jousting tournaments and archery contests. But modern sports betting, as an organized industry with sophisticated markets and professional bettors, is a relatively recent phenomenon. Its rapid growth, particularly in America following legalization, represents one of the most significant developments in contemporary gambling. Understanding modern sports betting and the broader gambling industry today requires examining economics, technology, culture, and policy in ways that reveal gambling's complex role in 21st century society. The modern sports betting industry has its roots in British bookmaking. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, British bookmakers accepted wagers on horse racing and other sports, operating in a legal or semi-legal grey area. The bookmaker model involved accepting bets from customers and using skill and knowledge to set odds that ensured profitability regardless of outcomes. Successful bookmakers needed mathematical ability, sports knowledge, and capital to cover potential losses. The profession attracted colourful characters, from honest businessmen to outright criminals. Horse racing was the premier betting sport for most of the 20th century. The sport of kings, as it was called, attracted betting from all social classes. Racetracks operated legal betting through parimutuel systems, where all bets of a particular type were pooled and the track took a percentage, with the remainder distributed to winners. This system, invented in France in the 1860s, spread worldwide and became the standard for legal race betting. Off-track betting parlours and illegal bookmakers supplemented the on-track betting, creating a complete ecosystem around horse racing. But horse racing's cultural dominance declined in the late 20th century as other sports grew more popular. Football, basketball, baseball, these team sports attracted massive fan interest and, inevitably, betting interest. The NFL in particular became America's betting sport, with the Super Bowl generating more gambling action than any other annual sporting event. The point spread. A betting innovation that handicapped the favoured team to create equal action on both sides, revolutionized football betting, and made even lopsided games interesting to bettors. In America, sports betting was mostly illegal for most of the 20th century. The 1961 Federal Wire Act prohibited using telecommunications for sports betting across state lines, targeting organized crime's interstate bookmaking operations. Most states also had laws against sports betting. The major exception was Nevada, where sports betting was legal and operated in Las Vegas casinos. Nevada sportsbooks became sophisticated operations, offering betting on virtually every professional and college sporting event, using computers to manage risk and constantly adjust odds based on betting action. Illegal bookmaking flourished despite prohibition. Local bookies took bets from friends and acquaintances, often extending credit and collecting debts through intimidation. Larger illegal operations, often connected to organized crime, handled millions in wagers. The Super Bowl alone generated billions in illegal bets annually. Law enforcement occasionally cracked down, but illegal sports betting was so pervasive and so intertwined with sports fandom that stopping it was impossible. The internet transformed sports betting, just as it transformed casino gambling. Offshore sportsbooks, based in countries with favorable regulations, offered betting to American customers despite its illegality. These sites provided convenience and variety that illegal bookies could not match. By the early 2000s, billions of dollars flowed to offshore sportsbooks from American bettors. The legal ambiguity was substantial. While operating a sportsbook in America was clearly illegal, the status of individuals placing bets online was less clear. The turning point came in 2018 when the United States Supreme Court struck down the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, a 1992 federal law that had prohibited states from legalizing sports betting. The court ruled that the federal government could not prevent states from regulating sports betting themselves. This decision opened the floodgates. State legislatures across America began legalizing and regulating sports betting, eager for the tax revenue and wanting to capture gambling activity that was already occurring illegally or through offshore sites. The pace of legalization was remarkable. Within 3 years of the Supreme Court decision, over half of American states had legalized sports betting in some form. Most allowed both in-person betting at casinos and online mobile betting through licensed apps. The largest sports betting companies, including DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, and others, launched aggressive marketing campaigns, sponsoring sports broadcasts, advertising during games, and offering promotional bonuses to new customers. The integration of sports betting into mainstream sports culture happened with stunning speed. Sports networks like ESPN launched dedicated betting content. Team stadiums announced betting lines during games. Smartphone apps allowed spectators to place bets while watching games, even to make in-game bets on events like the next play or the next score. Betting became part of how many fans experience sports, adding an extra layer of interest and engagement. The economic scale of legal American sports betting grew explosively. In 2022, Americans wagered over $95 billion legally on sports, generating billions in revenue for operators and hundreds of millions in tax revenue for states. This was despite not all states having legalized yet, and despite mature markets like Nevada and New Jersey having established sports betting for years. The growth trajectory suggested that within a decade, legal American sports betting might exceed $150 billion annually in total wagers. The global sports betting industry dwarfed even the American market. In Europe, sports betting was legal and popular in most countries, with a sophisticated regulatory framework and established operators. In Asia, despite prohibition in many countries, sports betting was enormous, with much of it occurring through illegal or offshore operators. The 2018 World Cup generated an estimated $155 billion in global betting, demonstrating the immense scale of sports gambling worldwide. Fantasy sports represented an interesting parallel development. Fantasy leagues, where participants draft teams of real players and compete based on those players' actual statistical performance, had existed since the 1960s but exploded in popularity with the internet. Daily fantasy sports, introduced in the 2000s, allowed single-day competitions rather than season-long commitments. Companies like DraftKings and FanDuel built massive businesses around daily fantasy, arguing it was a game of skill rather than gambling, and thus legal even where gambling was prohibited. The distinction between fantasy sports and sports betting was often hair-splitting. Both involved risking money on sports outcomes. Both required knowledge and skill but also involved chance. The main difference was that fantasy sports involved assembling a lineup before games began, while sports betting involved predicting specific game outcomes. Courts and legislatures struggled with where to draw the line, with different jurisdictions reaching different conclusions. The 2018 sports betting legalization somewhat obviated the debate, as many states legalized both. Esports, competitive video gaming, emerged as a new frontier for betting in the 2010s. Major esports tournaments attracted millions of viewers and prize pools worth millions of dollars. Inevitably, betting followed. Esports betting grew rapidly, particularly among younger demographics who had grown up with video games. The esports betting market was estimated at billions of dollars annually by 2020 and growing fast. It raised unique challenges, including match-fixing concerns in a young industry with less developed integrity protocols than traditional sports. The sophistication of modern sports betting markets rivals traditional financial markets in some ways. Professional bettors use statistical models, machine learning, and quantitative analysis to identify value bets where the odds offered are better than the true probability. Betting syndicates pool resources and expertise to move large amounts of money and potentially move markets. Betting exchanges, where bettors bet against each other rather than against the house, create liquid markets where odds are determined by supply and demand. The economic impact of legal sports betting extends beyond the obvious. Sportsbooks create jobs, generate tax revenue, and drive technology innovation, but they also potentially increase problem gambling, create new opportunities for corruption, and change the nature of sports fandom in ways that may be harmful. The debate about whether sports betting legalization was wise policy continues, with evidence accumulating on both sides. The gambling industry today is vast, diverse, and global. By some estimates, the total global gambling market exceeds $500 billion annually, including casinos, sports betting, lotteries, and online gambling. The industry employs millions worldwide, contributes billions in taxes, and entertains hundreds of millions of people. It is also sophisticated, using cutting-edge technology, employing mathematicians and data scientists, and operating under complex regulatory frameworks. Casinos have evolved from the simple gambling halls of the past into integrated resorts offering complete entertainment experiences. Modern mega casinos in Las Vegas, Macau, Singapore, and elsewhere are architectural wonders containing thousands of hotel rooms, dozens of restaurants, massive shopping centers, theaters, nightclubs, convention facilities, and of course, enormous casinos. They are cities unto themselves, serving millions of visitors annually and generating billions in revenue. The business model of modern casinos is sophisticated. They use customer tracking systems to monitor spending and offer rewards to high-value customers. They employ hosts who develop relationships with wealthy gamblers, offering free rooms, meals, flights, and entertainment to keep them coming back. They use data analytics to optimize everything from game placement to promotional offers. The days of mob-run casinos counting cash in back rooms are long gone, replaced by publicly traded corporations using Fortune 500 management practices. Lotteries remain a major form of gambling, particularly in jurisdictions that prohibit or limit other gambling forms. Government-run lotteries in America generated over $80 billion in ticket sales in 2020, making them one of the largest gambling sectors. The appeal of lotteries is the possibility of life-changing jackpots from small investments. The mathematical odds are terrible, with players facing house edges of 50% or more, but the dream of sudden wealth is powerful enough that millions buy tickets regularly, despite the odds. The cultural attitudes toward gambling vary enormously across the globe. In some societies, gambling is widely accepted as normal entertainment. In others, it remains highly stigmatized. Religious beliefs shape attitudes, with Christian, Islamic, and Buddhist traditions all having significant anti-gambling strands. Economic circumstances matter too. Wealthier societies can afford to treat gambling as entertainment, while poorer societies may see it as a destructive vice that impoverishes families. The regulatory approaches also vary dramatically. Some jurisdictions embrace gambling as an economic development tool, building casino industries and attracting tourists. Others strictly prohibit most or all gambling. Many fall somewhere in between, allowing some forms while prohibiting others, or permitting gambling but heavily regulating it. There is no international consensus on the right approach, and experimentation continues as jurisdictions observe each other's experiences. Looking to the future, several trends seem likely. Online gambling will continue to grow, potentially cannibalizing some physical casino revenue but expanding the overall market. Mobile will become even more dominant as the primary interface for online gambling. New technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality will create novel gambling experiences, though how mainstream these become remains to be seen. Artificial intelligence will make gambling operations more efficient and may enable more personalized experiences for customers. Regulation will likely continue to evolve, with more jurisdictions legalizing and regulating gambling that previously occurred illegally or not at all. The trend toward legalization reflects both pragmatic recognition that prohibition doesn't work well and government desire for tax revenue. But backlash is also possible if gambling-related problems become too visible or if research demonstrates harms that were underestimated. The integration of gambling into mainstream entertainment and culture will likely continue. Gambling elements appear in video games, often marketed to children through loot boxes and similar mechanics. Sports broadcasts increasingly incorporate betting content. Gambling normalizes as it becomes legal and visible. Whether this normalization is positive, making gambling a normal leisure activity without stigma, or negative, exposing more people to gambling risks, depends on one's values and assessment of evidence. What is certain is that gambling in some form will persist. The human attraction to risk and reward, to testing fate, to dreaming of fortune, these are fundamental enough that no law or moral teaching will eliminate them. The question is not whether humans will gamble, but how, in what forms, under what regulations, with what social consequences. These questions have been asked for 5,000 years and will continue to be asked as long as humans exist. And so we come to the end of our journey through gambling's history. From ancient knucklebones to modern smartphones, from Mesopotamian dice to Las Vegas mega resorts, from simple games to complex algorithms. It has been a journey through human nature itself, through our relationship with chance and risk, through our eternal hope that fortune might smile upon us. The story of gambling is ultimately the story of us. It reveals our capacity for joy and our vulnerability to addiction. It shows our cleverness in creating complex games and our foolishness in believing we can beat the odds. It demonstrates our social nature, gathering around tables to play together, and our isolation, sitting alone before slot machines. It reflects our dreams of sudden wealth and the harsh reality that the house usually wins. Yet for all its problems, gambling also represents something essentially human. The willingness to take risks, to venture into uncertainty, to hope for better fortune. These traits drove our ancestors to cross oceans, to build civilizations, to reach for the stars. The same impulse that makes us gamble also makes us innovate, explore, and create. Perhaps gambling, at its best, is practice for life itself, which is ultimately the greatest gamble of all. The dice continue to roll, as they have for 5,000 years. The wheels continue to spin. The cards continue to be dealt, and humans continue to play, continue to bet, continue to hope. The games may change, the technology may advance, the regulations may shift, but the fundamental human impulse to test fate remains constant. It is older than writing, older than civilization, perhaps as old as humanity itself. If tonight's journey through the history of gambling has intrigued you, if these stories of dice and cards, of fortunes won and lost, of games played across millennia and around the world have captured your imagination, consider subscribing to Nocturne of History for more explorations into the past's mysteries. Hit that like button if you found this fascinating. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And have you ever tried your luck at gambling? What's your game of choice? The night grows deep and the story is told. The dice have been thrown across the centuries. The cards have been dealt in countless hands. The wheels have spun from ancient Rome to modern Macau. And through it all, humans have gambled, will gamble, must gamble. Because something in our nature responds to the thrill of uncertainty, to the possibility that this time, this once, fortune might favor us. May your rest be peaceful tonight. And may your dreams be filled with all the games that might have been, all the bets that could have won, all the stories yet to be told. Until we meet again in the quiet hours between waking and sleeping, good night.